Vietnam has had enough of China's ambitions in the South China Sea, especially now that Beijing has yet again provoked Hanoi with a move that won't surprise you. But China is risking a lot in this latest round of the Great Game in one of the world's most heated regions. It hates when other countries have the guts to stand up to it, and Vietnam has proven that more than once. But what's really fueling this high-stakes feud, and just how far is China willing to push its luck? Since China seized the Paracel Islands in 1974, its clashes with Vietnam over South China Sea territory have only gotten fiercer. The two countries continue to battle over rocks, shoals, and even Vietnam's maritime boundaries, with flashpoints like the Spratlys standing as symbols of China's relentless drive for dominance. As China's power has surged, so has its audacity, dredging reefs, building fortresses on remote islands, and flexing its muscle against the commerce of other nations. But China's aggressions don't stop at Vietnam. It's ramped up pressure on the Philippines too. Since grabbing the Scarborough Shoal in 2012, China has flouted international law, laying claim to waters that clearly belong in the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. The result? A surge in volatile encounters between Filipino and Chinese vessels, including a recent October 8th clash where a Chinese Coast Guard vessel fired on a Philippine Fisheries Bureau ship near the contested shoal. Yet China may find Vietnam a much harder rival to back down, especially now that it's pushing further by reviving old claims to the Gulf of Tonkin, a step that guarantees a fierce response from Hanoi. China had once claimed the entirety of the Gulf of Tonkin under the original 11-line map drawn before the Communist Party took over. Mao later abandoned that claim, but it appears that China might want to start the process of asserting it again. Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin said it was China's legitimate and lawful right to determine the territorial sea baseline in the Gulf of Tonkin. Vietnam's response was somewhat different. Its foreign ministry made the following statement: Vietnam believes that coastal countries need to abide by the UNCLOS when establishing the territorial baseline used to calculate the width of territorial waters to ensure that it does not affect the lawful rights and interests of other countries, including the freedom of navigation and the freedom of passage through straits used for international maritime activities in accordance with UNCLOS. China and Vietnam had seemingly settled their maritime demarcation line with an agreement in 2000. While the latest map does not interfere with that settled boundary, Hanoi knows that the word settled is written in water as far as Beijing is concerned. Only the fear of taking a few hits in return will prevent China from expanding this latest claim in the future. Fortunately for Vietnam, it's taken more than a few steps to give China the chills, both in the past and present. For Vietnam, deterring China begins with forging better relations with its old enemy, the United States. Since 2020, Vietnam has participated in the Quad Plus framework. It's also significantly increased its economic ties to the United States, with bilateral trade more than quadrupling from $30 billion in 2013 to $139 billion in 2023. That year, President Biden paid a historic state visit to Hanoi. To mark the occasion, the two nations announced that they were elevating their bilateral relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership. This is not an alliance. Vietnam has a long-standing policy in place to avoid such entanglements. However, its drift into America's orbit is clear. Vietnam has been reluctant to forge fully fledged security ties, but it seems inevitable that geopolitical reality will increase defense cooperation. Forging deeper economic ties with the United States gives it an incentive to assist Vietnam in its disputes with China. Vietnam is also seeking to host more factories for American companies on its territory, which is a move that makes sense for both sides. For the United States, relocating supply chains to Vietnam is important to ensure that China has less leverage over the American economy. The more Vietnam hosts important manufacturing parts of the supply chain for the American and global economies, the more important its tranquility becomes to the rest of the world, which means more of an interest in defending it against China's attempts at expansion. But Vietnam is not only looking to forge deeper partnerships with the superpower across the Pacific. Vietnam has also forged a comprehensive strategic partnership with Japan, an upgrade in their bilateral relations that was announced in November 2023. That same month, Vietnam and Indonesia strengthened their cooperation on defense. The two countries declared that their navies, coast guards, defense industries, training methods, and strategic research would have practical and effective coordination at all levels. In August 2024, Vietnam strengthened its military cooperation with the Philippines, particularly in maritime matters, and committed to resolving whatever disputes they had peacefully. Both countries dispute islands in the South China Sea, but know that they must team up against their much more powerful common adversary. Vietnam has also forged deeper ties with India, which also has an interest in preventing China's expansion in the region. As recently as November 2024, Vietnam and India engaged in bilateral military exercises. This VinBax 2024 exercise was meant to enhance the joint military capability of both countries in their medical and engineering contingents as part of a broader United Nations peacekeeping operation. The exercise was small, but was a demonstration of the two countries' shared interest. Vietnam is a geographically important part of India's Necklace of Diamonds strategy to counter China's so-called String of Pearls in the Indian Ocean. Vietnam and India have not had as robust an economic relationship as they might have wanted, but recent moves suggest a willingness on both countries to fix this. In July, Vietnam's Prime Minister, Pham Minh Chinh, called for a $20 billion bilateral trade target between the two countries. Vietnam and India also signed MOUs on increased cooperation in aviation, logistics, pharmaceuticals, and renewable energy. The forum where these MOUs were signed also saw the first direct flight between Da Nang and Ahmedabad, symbolizing hopes for greater interconnectivity. Vietnam is steadily building a coalition to balance against China, yet it maintains a fierce self-reliance. Observing China's aggressions in the region, including toward the Philippines, a treaty ally of the United States, Vietnam is determined to strengthen its own defenses without becoming over-reliant on any foreign power. The US support remains a key factor, yet Vietnam aims to stand strong and prepared on its own terms. Vietnam has been more historically willing to contest China's claims in the area, even if it comes with a risk of escalation. In fact, it has its own outposts in the Spratly Islands just like China. China occupies the three largest features in the Spratlys, Mischief, Subi, and Fiery Cross Reefs, but Vietnam occupies 5 of the remaining 7 largest features, including Bark Canada Reef, the 4th largest. Satellite footage from the Center for Strategic and International Studies Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative has revealed that Vietnam built 692 acres of land across 10 features in the Spratlys between November 2023 and June 2024. This pace was significantly above the 404 acres between January and November of 2023 and 342 acres in all of 2022. In total, Vietnam has created 2,360 acres of land in the South China Sea, about half of China's 4,650, and Hanoi has done this in little time too. In 2021, Vietnam had only created 329 acres. As an example, Vietnam's Canada Bark Reef is now 4,318 meters long. This is more than enough for Vietnam to build a runway for military aircraft like those seen in China's fortified islands. Several of the features boast new trench networks and coastal defenses. Some have also hosted temporary helipads. Surprisingly, China has done little to contest Vietnam's increasing presence in the South China Sea. While China has greatly tightened the screws around the Philippines, it's avoided doing the same with Vietnam. Although it's possible that China has avoided raising issues with Vietnam because it does not want to create issues with multiple countries at the same time and avoid bringing them into a closer coalition, Zach Cooper and Gregory Poling, writing for War on the Rocks, don't view this as a likely explanation. After all, China under Xi Jinping has raised territorial issues with multiple countries on more than one front simultaneously, ranging from the Senkaku Islands in southern Japan to the remote Himalayas that have seen clashes with India. A much more assertive China has been the norm for Xi's tenure. Instead, the likelier answer for why China has not contested Vietnam is because it believes this particular rival is harder to bully. Cooper and Poling report that Chinese officials have privately expressed their belief that the Philippines will go along with what China wants in the end. Rodrigo Duterte's presidency from 2016 to 22 reinforced this sentiment. Duterte often tried to forge closer relations with China in an attempt to become more independent from the United States, despite the South China Sea dispute. That idea backfired and gave Beijing the impression that it could get away with what it wanted at the Philippines' expense. Vietnam, on the other hand, has repeatedly proven ready to contest China's moves. It accepted battle in 1974 and 1988 after all. Vietnam might have lost those clashes, but it proved its willingness to inflict cost on an aggressive China. And it's not always lost when things have gotten hot. China knows all too well what Vietnam is capable of from its miserable border war with the Vietnamese in 1979, where the People's Liberation Army performed poorly in the face of battle-hardened Vietnamese troops. China's higher echelons know what Vietnam is capable of. Two of Beijing's current top military officers, Generals Zhang Yuxia and Liu Zhenli of the Central Military Commission, are outliers because, unlike the vast majority of their peers, they actually have combat experience. They are veterans of that border war, so they know what Vietnamese troops are capable of. With this in mind, they have likely advised caution when it comes to dealing with Vietnam. Vietnam has the world's third highest amount of total military personnel, including reserves, with 5.850 million total members. That means that 56.9 per 1,000 people in Vietnam are members of the country's armed forces. In terms of active personnel, Vietnam is ranked 9th in the world with 600,000. Although the active army is far smaller than China's, Vietnam has proven itself a capable fighting force and unafraid to stand up to China. Chinese leaders don't need to go as far back as the border war to remember this either. On May 1, 2014, China sent an oil rig, the Haiyang Shiyu 981, and 3 service ships south from Hainan Island. The ship, which the China National Offshore Oil Corporation's chairman had earlier called a strategic weapon, moved near Triton Island in the Paracels. These are the waters that China and Vietnam both claim, but China crossed the line, literally. The rig then tried to conduct exploratory drilling on 2 blocks of hydrocarbons that Vietnam had claimed but did not begin developing. The location was 120 nautical miles east of Vietnam's Lai Son Island and 180 miles south of Hainan, making it a hotspot on the two nations' theoretical economic limits under UNCLOS. The oil rig fell within the Vietnamese side of a delimiting line drawn between the two countries. Perhaps looking at what happened in Scarborough Shoal 2 years earlier, Vietnam wasted no time in reasserting its rights to the area. Ships from the Vietnamese Coast Guard and Fisheries Resources Surveillance were immediately sent to intercept the Chinese oil rig and prevent it from conducting its explorations in the area. On May 3rd, the Vietnamese ships tried to disrupt the oil rig's operations. China quickly sent more ships to assist the rig, including ships from its Coast Guard, civilian fishing vessels, and possibly ships from the People's Liberation Army Navy. China put its ships in protective rings, which it had done in disputes with Vietnam on the seas before. Collisions between Chinese and Vietnamese ships happened immediately, with both sides blaming the other. By May 7th, Hanoi reported that 60 Chinese ships and dozens of aircraft were in the area, while Vietnam increased its number of ships to 29. The Vietnamese quickly repaired their damaged ships and sent them back into the fray. In Vietnam itself, large protests against China's actions occurred outside the embassy in Hanoi. The demonstrations turned into fully fledged rioting on May 13th, when vandals damaged foreign-owned factories that they believed were under Chinese ownership. At least 200 people had been arrested over the violence and chaos. Beijing responded fiercely and accused Hanoi of egging the violence on. The Chinese government even issued travel warnings. The situation at sea escalated from there. China accused Vietnam of deploying 60 ships, while Vietnam said China deployed as many as 130. The ships were larger than their Vietnamese counterparts, but that didn't stop Vietnam from continuing to contest the attempt by the Chinese to tap the oil in the area, despite one of its fishing vessels being sunk in a collision. There were even rumors that China had mobilized troops in the border regions. But on May 27th, China suddenly ended the standoff by pulling the oil rig northeast of Triton Island. Officially, the reason was that a second round of exploration for oil and gas was beginning. In June, a high-ranking Chinese official visited Hanoi, which coincided with some of the Chinese Coast Guard ships withdrawing and the oil rig's drilling equipment being retracted. On July 15th, the rig withdrew from the area a month ahead of schedule. The attempt to bully Vietnam out of these waters failed. It was one of Beijing's biggest setbacks in the South China Sea dispute. Clashes with Vietnam in 2019 and 23 continued to prove that Vietnam continues to be willing to stand up to Chinese attempts at coercion. With Vietnam's continued cooperation with foreign partners that also have an interest in containing China's expansion into the South China Sea, Vietnam aims to make sure that it will be in an even stronger position to contest China's claims in the future. Understandably, China does not want to repeat these experiences. It also does not want to risk creating a more durable coalition in the area, as Vietnam has been attempting to do. So China has recently tried to make nice with the Vietnamese. In December 2023, only 3 months after Biden's visit, China attempted to strengthen its bilateral relations with Vietnam. The two countries signed a 16-page joint declaration and 36 cooperation documents during Xi's own state visit to Hanoi that month. The agreements included infrastructure priorities, such as the joint building of a new bridge across the Red River. When completed, it will connect China's Yunnan province with Lao Cai in Vietnam. The two countries also intend to create interoperable railways that connect southern China to Vietnam's port of Haiphong. There were also communications agreements, a memorandum of understanding on developing green technologies, and a pledge to create a new economic zone to make trade and investment between the two countries easier. Surprisingly, there were security statements as well, including an agreement to create a hotline between the Vietnamese Agriculture Ministry and the Chinese Coast Guard to respond to surprise incidents over fisheries in the South China Sea. joint rescue operations at sea, security and intelligence cooperation against hostile forces, and even joint naval patrols in the Gulf of Tonkin. China has increased its imports of durians from Vietnam, but recent actions against this partnership may be on shaky ground. This month, China's customs officials halted shipments from 33 Vietnamese durian suppliers, citing quality concerns amid a rush for market share. However, while China seems content with Vietnam producing fruit-like durians, it has its sights set on controlling far more critical industries. China has attempted to flood the global market with dumped steel sold for a lower price than what it takes to produce. China's strategy comes from its own economic weakness, as its construction sector has not been as strong as anticipated after the COVID-19 pandemic. Chinese steelmakers created more product than the market demanded. This overproduction only exacerbated an existing excess of product in response to the pre-pandemic tariffs that the first Trump administration levied on China. China attempted to circumvent these fees by producing more steel to sell at lower prices. As a result, there is now a vast oversupply of steel in China. China has tried to make use of the excess by dumping the product on Southeast Asia in particular. The artificially cheap steel puts Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam at the risk of long-term dependency on Chinese steel. Steel is a vital component of almost every part of a national economy. Construction projects, of course, require it, but the price of steel affects the price of all consumer goods directly or indirectly. It's also a vital industry for national defense. Should Vietnam's steel industry fall under Chinese influence, it would have a tough time indeed building the ships it needs for another standoff with China over rights in the South China Sea, to name only one example. This is why Vietnam is fighting Chinese steel dumping. In December 2023, it imposed an anti-dumping tax on cold-rolled steel coming from China. This fee was in response to a $31.4 billion steel trade deficit with China in the first 11 months of 2023. In June 24, Vietnam began an anti-dumping investigation into steel products coming from China and South Korea. This was another demonstration of Vietnam being a country less willing to put up with China's typical tactics. On the whole, Vietnam is unlike other countries in the South China Sea. It's had a consistent history of standing up to its more powerful northern neighbor, often at considerable risk, and the regime in Beijing has a preference for bullying and doing its business in the shadows. It asserts itself with salami-slicing tactics and in gray zone operations where it has an overwhelming hard power or psychological advantage, but when the light of day gets shined on its operations, it reacts differently. As the clash in 2014 showed, the Chinese government hates when it gets itself involved in an extended and highly public dispute. Beijing is actually quite risk-averse. When it calculates that it has a risk of incurring significant costs, it tends to back off, as it did in 2014. Vietnam has been unusually aware of this fact compared to China's other neighbors and has acted accordingly. Vietnam might not have been able to stop China from taking over the Paracels or much of the Spratlys, but has always shown its willingness to fight. Sometimes that's enough to scare the bully off. But what do you think is coming next in the tense relationship between China and Vietnam? How does a small nation avoid being swallowed by a colossal neighbor? This age-old question continues to haunt global politics and shapes the strategies of many countries today. Take Ukraine in 1994, just after the Soviet Union's dissolution. With the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal suddenly under its control, Ukraine faced a critical decision. The Budapest Memorandum seemed like a safety net, offering security assurances from Russia, the US, and other Western powers in exchange for Ukraine surrendering its nuclear weapons. However, this deal, lacking the teeth of a formal military alliance, failed to protect Ukraine from further aggression, showcasing the potential pitfalls of relinquishing such a powerful deterrent. Now, as China's military clout grows under Xi Jinping's assertive leadership, smaller nations in the Indo-Pacific are on edge, drawing parallels to Ukraine's past predicaments. In this video, we delve into the strategic shifts of Vietnam and Indonesia, two nations ensnared in the contentious South China Sea disputes. Both countries staunchly oppose China's expansive Nine-Dash Line claim, with Vietnam facing the most immediate threats. Join us as we explore how these nations are adapting their foreign policies to avoid Ukraine's fate, striving for security in a region shadowed by a looming superpower. Vietnam shares a land border with China that is 806 miles long. In early 1979, this border became the stage for a conflict between the two countries. 220,000 troops from China's People's Liberation Army attacked all 6 of Vietnam's border provinces that February. They occupied 23 cities and towns, up to a penetration of about 25 miles into Vietnamese territory. 3 weeks after the invasion, China declared that its mission had been accomplished and went home. Truthfully, the PLA had not performed as well as Beijing had hoped for. although the casualty figures coming from both sides are untrustworthy. Minor border clashes on land continued until 1991, when Vietnam and China normalized their diplomatic relations in the wake of the end of the Cold War. This normalization marked the end of the land boundary dispute between China and Vietnam. However, the two continue to dispute maritime boundaries and have ever since China seized control of the Paracel Islands in 1974. The naval battle there saw the deaths of over 100 then South Vietnamese personnel. 48 more plus one American liaison officer were captured, 18 Chinese were killed, and 67 more wounded. Vietnam still claims the islands, but China has controlled them to this day. The two also claim control over the Spratly Islands and have fought a battle there too. In 1988, Vietnam and China clashed with each other at sea again, this time near Johnson's South Reef in the Spratlys. China again prevailed, with 64 Vietnamese sailors being killed in action. China has controlled the reef ever since and began militarizing it with air defense systems in 2016. There's also no telling whether or not China will reopen the land dispute with Vietnam again. China has been keen to raise outlandish territorial issues with all of its neighbors, even its supposed unlimited strategic partner, Russia. This is a calculated foreign policy move on the part of Beijing. The grey zone operations that result from these claims gradually wear down the resolve and resources of China's neighbors, allowing it to steadily gain ground in the region. This was precisely how China gained control of the Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines in 2012. It was also how China steadily pushed its claims on the disputed border with India, which saw a series of deadly confrontations between 2020 and 2022. As a result of having an aggressive great power for a neighbor that it has frosty relations with at the best of times, Vietnam is a highly militarized state. It's ranked third in the list of countries with the most total military personnel at 5.52 million, despite being 16th in world population with a little over 100 million. This puts Vietnam at having a military population of almost 57 per 1,000 people. However, of these personnel, only about 600,000 are on active duty. There are 5 million reservists and 250,000 paramilitary troops. China has the largest active standing army in the world, with almost 2.03 million active personnel. There are almost 510,000 reservists and 625,000 paramilitary troops in the Chinese military. China also has a decisive advantage in air power, tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, logistics, and of course, naval power. Vietnam's military may punch above its weight as it did in 1979, but it has no chance in an all-out confrontation. Vietnam is therefore gradually seeking new relationships in a burgeoning coalition to check the expansion of Chinese power in the Indo-Pacific region. This marks a departure from the country's traditional foreign policy, which is marked by 3 no's: no military alliances, no foreign military bases on Vietnamese territory, and no reliance on any country to combat others. Vietnam's only formal ally is its western neighbor Laos, with which it has ideological ties rooted in Marxism as much as it has shared security interests. Political obstacles have also prevented Vietnam from joining international alignments. Despite sharing a common security interest against China's expansionism, Vietnam's territorial disputes in the South China Sea involve the Philippines, Taiwan, and Malaysia. These disputes have prevented those countries from fully coalescing into a true coalition against Beijing's ambitions. Additionally, there are ideological issues. The US-led alliance network tends to have an ideological component, with the opposition to communism and support of multi-party democratic values as 2 vital components. Vietnam is still a one-party socialist state. The country's official constitutional name is the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. As much as the economic commitment to Marxist ideas in economics has waned over the decades, the insistence on liberal values by the United States and its allies still creates a point of contention between Vietnam and its potential partners in a coalition against China. Despite these obstacles, the past few years have been marked by a flurry of diplomatic activity from Hanoi. For example, Vietnam has cooperated in the Quad Plus framework. This framework is an expansion of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, the informal grouping of the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. Vietnam began to participate in some of these discussions as early as 2020, along with South Korea and New Zealand. The talks began with how these countries were handling the COVID-19 pandemic, as the Quad began to shift from a purely security-based conference to one which focused on broader issues. Vietnam has had a recurring presence in Quad Plus meetings since 2020. Vietnam has also gradually gotten itself involved in the economic and diplomatic network led by its former enemy, the United States. Since 2013, annual bilateral trade between the United States and Vietnam increased from $30 billion to $139 billion. Not coincidentally, President Biden paid a state visit to Vietnam in the autumn of 2023. There, he, alongside Nguyen Phu Trong, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam, declared that the two nations were elevating their bilateral relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership. The partnership is ostensibly based on economic opportunities, giving Vietnam the ability to grow its economy through further American investment. Security issues were not emphasized in the official announcement of the new bilateral relationship. For the United States, though, the investments in Vietnam serve a security as well as an economic purpose, as they offer more options for American firms to move critical supply chains out of China. Beijing's behavior during the pandemic, when it threatened the global medical supply chain, forced Washington to double down on its efforts to relocate these manufacturing processes. It's also far from out of the question that the strategic partnership will eventually encompass a security dimension, as relations between the two countries improve in the face of new realities in the region. Vietnam has also struck up a growing partnership with America's Quad partner India. For India in particular, Vietnam is vital. It sits on the root of New Delhi's so-called Necklace of Diamonds strategy, the series of investments and bilateral relationships it hopes to forge to counter China's rival String of Pearls, which threatens to encircle India. India hopes that the Necklace of Diamonds will be a counter-encirclement of China, and Vietnam sits directly along that route. As such, India and Vietnam maintain good bilateral relations and have begun to strengthen their security ties independent of the Quad Plus framework. In 2020, India sold one patrol boat to Vietnam. Vietnam has also expressed interest in India's BrahMos ramjet supersonic cruise missile. However, after China raised concerns, the sale was not finalized. Vietnam has not yet signed on to any of India's strategic or infrastructure investments, but the country's gradual shift of its foreign policy is still in its relative infancy. As China continues its attempts to expand its influence in the region, India will likely serve as an ideal and necessary ally for the Vietnamese. The two nations share many mutual interests. Indonesia occupies a different seat at the region's table. It has a much friendlier relationship with China than Vietnam does. The two countries signed the Indonesia-China Strategic Partnership in 2005. Indonesia is also one of the biggest participants in China's Belt and Road Initiative, with almost $17 billion in Chinese capital invested there between 2014 and 2018 as part of the project. By December 2023, total Chinese investment in Indonesia amounted to nearly $44 billion. Bilateral trade in 2022 amounted to $73.4 billion. Compared to the $27.19 billion in trade between Indonesia and the United States that year. Xi Jinping also has a close personal relationship with Indonesia's President Joko Widodo, who has been in office since 2014. Indonesia's geography affords it greater security from China's moves compared to Vietnam. It's located thousands of miles away from the Chinese mainland overseas. Consequently, it can have friendlier relations with Beijing. Nevertheless, even though the relationship between the two countries is good, there are underlying tensions which have come as a result of China's expansionist attitude in the region. Indonesia has not been involved in the most bitter battles of the South China Sea dispute like Vietnam has, but it still disputes China's 9-dash line. In particular, Indonesia has a contentious relationship with both China and Vietnam over the Natuna Islands which it governs. Although the islands slightly coincide with the 9-dash line, China renounced its claim over them in 1995, but not in a complete way. It still claims ownership of the rich oil and gas field northeast of the islands that was discovered 2 years earlier. Chinese and Vietnamese fishing boats have often come into these waters as well. On March 19, 2016, the Chinese Coast Guard rammed an Indonesian ship that had attempted to detain Chinese nationals for illegally fishing there. Indonesia's foreign ministry leveled a complaint with its Chinese counterpart 2 days later. Indonesia stepped up its destruction of illegal foreign fishing boats in response to this incident, and that June, President Widodo visited the Natuna Islands on a warship to demonstrate that his country would defend its sovereignty. The increase in tensions in the area eventually prompted the Indonesians to move one of their naval headquarters to the Natuna Islands to protect their country's territorial integrity. The move was in 2020, but that still didn't stop the Chinese Coast Guard from trying to interfere with Indonesian oil exploration in the area in December 2021. Perhaps unsurprisingly, public opinion of China in Indonesia began to decline through the 2010s, as Beijing threw its weight around under Xi Jinping. In a 2014 poll conducted by the BBC, 52% of Indonesians viewed Chinese influence in the area positively, compared to 28% that viewed it negatively. 7 years later, attitudes had changed significantly. Australia's Lowy Institute found that only 43% of Indonesians now thought that China's growth was good for their country. 60% said that Indonesia should join other countries to limit China's influence in the region. 48% thought that China's aim was to become the dominant power in Asia. Indonesia has in fact made some subtle moves to counter Chinese influence in the region, and China must be concerned about these moves because of Indonesia's strategic geography. The country occupies some of the most important real estate in the Indo-Pacific. Its most important geostrategic limitation of China is that its island of Sumatra occupies the southern part of the Strait of Malacca. This critical choke point has long been an object of worry for policymakers in Beijing. As early as 2003, then Chinese leader Hu Jintao warned of the threat that would come to China because of the actions of certain powers that aimed to control the Strait of Malacca. In 2016, almost 80% of China's oil imports came through this choke point. The volume of trade has only increased since then. China has attempted to develop alternative and less vulnerable routes through its investments in Pakistan and its relationship with Russia, but these have not yet replaced China's reliance on the strait. Cutting off shipping through the Strait of Malacca for only a week would increase the cost of global maritime trade by about $65 million. Every month would cost about $280 million, according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Taking advantage of this geography, Indonesia has expanded its relationship with India, whose Andaman and Nicobar Islands lie only 90 nautical miles to the north of Sumatra. The Indian armed forces have a significant presence on these islands, with 7 air and naval bases, the country's only joint tri-service command, and further improvements coming. Missile batteries, more warships, drones, and soldiers are on their way. In 2023, the United States also gained some access to these islands, as the US Navy signed a 5-year Master Shipyard Repair Agreement (MSRA) with Larsen & Toubro Shipyard in Chennai. India can easily participate as a partner in this area should it choose to do so. India and Indonesia have cooperated in other ways too. Like the bilateral relationship with China, Jakarta and New Delhi have long had amicable relations, and the two countries work together at the level of a strategic partnership. Indonesia also has been keen to cooperate with India's grander ambitions. Unlike Vietnam, India has been a much more concrete partner in India's Necklace of Diamonds strategy. It granted India military access to its Sabang port, which occupies the northern entrance of the Strait of Malacca, in 2018. The military access includes Indian investments in improvements to the port. Indonesia and the United States have also steadily advanced their bilateral relations. In November 2023, a month after the announcement of the strategic partnership with Vietnam, President Biden hosted Widodo at the White House. There, the two leaders announced the new US-Indonesia Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. The partnership covered various economic initiatives. These included diversifying the semiconductor supply chain, American investments in Indonesian businesses, and improving the country's rural connectivity were also major items in the agreement. Indonesia is also a source of nickel, a vital component in the battery technology found in electric vehicles. American enterprises are keen to gain access to this resource. However, security items were also major components of the new partnership, a big difference from the one with Vietnam. The United States and Indonesia have had significant security ties for many years. Indonesia has long been a purchaser of the F-16. In 2022, it expanded this relationship by purchasing the F-15EX to replace its Russian Su-27 and Su-30 fighters. Expanding on these ties, the two countries signed a new defense cooperation arrangement as part of the new strategic partnership. Cybersecurity and counterterrorism were part of the agreement, as was American assistance to improve Indonesia's maritime domain awareness and sea enforcement. This provision will help to improve India's ability to confront the pirates that prowl its crowded waters, and more dramatically, will help it to keep an eye on Chinese maritime activities. Most importantly, this agreement includes provisions for joint exercises between the US and Indonesian militaries. The agreement was not an alliance, but did build on the burgeoning security relationship between the two countries. American and Indonesian forces conducting joint exercises and using some of the same equipment puts the two in position to undertake more significant operations if the need arises, like closing the Strait of Malacca to Chinese shipping. India's cooperation in this matter would be almost certain. Indonesia has not been a party to the Quad Plus talks and has not yet shown a willingness to become more deeply involved in multilateral efforts. However, Indonesia's status as the world's third largest democracy with free elections in a multi-party system, means there is less ideological friction between Washington and Jakarta than in the US-Vietnam relationship. Should Indonesia choose to participate in the US-led network, it will have a smoother time doing so. Jakarta's overall foreign policy is in some degree a measure of balancing the United States and China against one another to ensure that it can maintain its independence. Indonesia's current president-elect, Prabowo Subianto, is a good personal example of this policy. As the Minister of Defense, he was the one responsible for procuring the purchases of the F-15EX. Yet he has also called China a friendly nation, criticized the West while stating Indonesia should learn from Asian nations including China, and entertained the notion of joining the BRICS bloc. Nevertheless, by strengthening its economic and military cooperation with the United States, which Subianto has not pledged to abandon, Indonesia has also set itself on a course to maximize its geopolitical advantage and exercise a greater amount of leverage over China. Becoming too aggressive against Indonesia carries far more costs for China than aggression against Vietnam. With these factors on its side, Indonesia is a lot less likely to become like Ukraine. When a great power begins to assert itself and disrupt the traditional balance in a region, lesser powers will need to reassess their go-to foreign policies. China's rise has served this purpose for both Vietnam and Indonesia, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine sets a stark reminder of what can happen to nations that have such an assertive great power for a neighbor. Indonesia seems to be adjusting more quickly than Vietnam. The latter is still reluctant to cast aside its traditional non-alignment. Nevertheless, Vietnam's gradual shift toward the growing coalition against Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific region is inevitable. Security considerations will always be the most decisive factor in the foreign policy of a state. Since Vietnam's security situation is far more precarious than Indonesia's, Hanoi might well take a page out of Jakarta's playbook and upgrade its strategic partnership with the United States. Vietnam might not enjoy America's promotion of multi-party democracy, but it ultimately has little choice when an aggressive China sits right across the border. What further moves do you think Vietnam and Indonesia will make to ensure they do not become the subject of Chinese aggression in the region? Will Vietnam continue to shift its foreign policy toward alignment with its old enemy as conditions in Asia change? What will Subianto's taking power in October mean for the relationship between Indonesia and the United States? China has been encroaching upon Philippine territory in the South China Sea for years. For the most part, the country didn't face a lot of resistance, which isn't surprising given its economic and military might, and in particular, its large navy. Simply put, it takes immense courage to stand up to China. But recently, the Philippines has shown that sort of defiance as well, demonstrating remarkable bravery in the face of such overwhelming power. It's a tale as old as time: David versus Goliath. But Goliath was overconfident when facing off against David, mocking him with bravado. China, on the other hand, seems to fear its David, who looks determined to stand his ground, come what may. But it hasn't always been the case. The Philippines was wary of making any bold declarations, feeling mercilessly bullied by China. So what's changed? Why is a small island nation suddenly scaring a global military powerhouse? Keep watching to find out. Now, of course, we can't discuss how the situation in the South China Sea changed without first explaining the dynamics in the region. To the surprise of no one, China is the primary source of virtually all tensions in the South China Sea. Or to be more precise, China's sweeping claims of sovereignty over almost all of the 1.4 million square miles of this crucial waterway is the point of contention. Naturally, these brazen claims of indisputable sovereignty have put China at odds with other countries in the region, which all assert ownership of the island's reefs and undersea resources in the South China Sea, including the 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and 11 billion barrels of untapped oil. The countries with the competing claims are Brunei, Malaysia, Vietnam, Taiwan, and of course, the Philippines. China has responded to these competing claims by essentially trying to militarize the South China Sea, constructing artificial bases armed with anti-ship and anti-aircraft missile systems, fighter jets, and jamming equipment. The country's aggressive stance and unyielding commitment to these military bases have escalated tensions in the region, drawing international condemnation. They've practically turned the South China Sea into one of the most contested regions in the world and a flashpoint for global conflagration. And yet the Philippines seems to be the only nation in the region willing to openly and continuously confront China's territorial ambitions and military buildup. The confrontation in question has led to a series of naval run-ins, primarily focused around two flashpoints, the Second Thomas Shoal and the Scarborough Shoal. The second Thomas Shoal, also known as the Ayungin Shoal, is an 11 nautical mile long teardrop-shaped submerged reef located in the Spratly Islands of the South China Sea, less than 200 nautical miles west of Palawan, the largest province in the Philippines. Although this territory is claimed by multiple nations, the Philippines is the only one to maintain a military presence in the second Thomas Shoal. However, to be honest, the term military presence might be overselling it a bit. The presence in question is less than a dozen Philippine Navy Marines stationed on a 330-foot-long LST-542 class tank landing ship called the Sierra Madre. The ship was originally built for the US Navy during World War II and transferred to the Philippines after the Vietnam War. But how did the Sierra Madre make it onto the second Thomas Shoal, virtually becoming a makeshift military base? Actually, the Philippine Navy left it there on purpose. It deliberately ran the ship aground on the second Thomas Shoal in 1999 in order to assert sovereignty over the area and maintain a continuous military presence. And that's precisely what it's done for the last 25 years. Of course, the years also took a toll on the ship itself, which now resembles a rusty shipwreck straight out of a post-apocalyptic movie. But the Sierra Madre, with all its rust and holes, is still very much an actively commissioned ship in the Philippine Navy's roster. So any assault on the Sierra Madre would be classified as an act of war. Talk about Philippine ingenuity. Thanks to the Sierra Madre, China can't blockade the second Thomas Shoal, which it had attempted on multiple occasions. Besides the obvious sovereignty aspect, the reef is also highly desirable for its lucrative fishing grounds and access to the nearby reed bank, packed with oil and natural gas reserves. The second notable flashpoint in the South China Sea, the Scarborough Shoal, is also teeming with fish. In fact, this 58-square-mile atoll is a traditional fishing ground for Filipino fishermen. Of course, the shoal's abundant fisheries aren't the only reason for the maritime standoff that's been going on for 12 years. The Scarborough Shoal is also strategically significant due to its location, making it a fantastic air and naval base. The nation that holds the Scarborough Shoal could potentially control the maritime traffic in the South China Sea. If this nation were China, the reefs of the Scarborough Shoal would be demolished, delicate corals ground up, and the debris used to build artificial landmasses to host massive missile sites, naval piers, and radar installations for its armed forces. That's the fate that befell other reefs and shoals in the South China Sea under Chinese control. However, the Philippines isn't allowing the same to happen to this shoal, which lies within the Philippines Exclusive Economic Zone or EEZ, some 130 miles west of Luzon, the country's biggest island. That's why the Philippine vessels around the shoal always stand their ground, despite China's many attempts to intimidate them. Speaking of intimidation, China has been trying to assert its dominance through aggressive maneuvers against Philippine vessels for years. Ever since the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, Netherlands, ruled that China's territorial claims in the South China Sea were legally invalid, the country has seemingly taken an alternative approach, choosing brute force over diplomacy. These displays of force have intensified in the last few years, undoubtedly escalating in the summer of 2024. So much so that the retired Filipino naval officer and former Senator Antonio Trillanes described the current relations between China and the Philippines as the worst in recent memory, while Teresita Ang-si, a Filipino civic leader and activist, said these relations are at their lowest ebb and on the brink of total breakdown. With this in mind, let's do a quick rundown of the major naval run-ins that have brought the relations between China and the Philippines to a boiling point. The summer of 2023 was when things first started warming up between the two nations. In August 2023, the China Coast Guard, or CCG, fired water cannons at Filipino Coast Guard, or PCG, ships in the South China Sea. Chinese ships also performed dangerous maneuvers around the PCG vessels, which were escorting supply ships en route to the second Thomas Shoal. In September, the PCG removed a 980-foot-long floating barrier installed to block the entrance to the lagoon at the Scarborough Shoal, leaving over 50 Philippine fishing boats outside the shoal. In October, a CCG ship and its accompanying vessel rammed a PCG ship and a military-run supply boat off the second Thomas Shoal, damaging both. In November, China once again blasted a Philippine supply ship heading to the second Thomas Shoal with water cannons. In December, the CCG did the same, but this time, General Romeo Brawner Jr., the head of the 150,000-member-strong Philippine Armed Forces, was aboard the vessel that got bumped. Brawner joined the crew on the Unisa May 1, a small wooden-hulled supply boat, to personally deliver Christmas gifts, food, and other necessary supplies to the Filipino Marines stationed aboard BRP Sierra Madre. Having experienced China's aggression in the South China Sea firsthand, Brawner vowed that the nation would continue supporting its frontline troops and protecting fishermen at all costs. Water cannon attacks continued throughout 2024. On March 5th, the CCG blasted a supply boat with these powerful devices, shattering its windshield and injuring 4 Filipino crew members. Less than 3 weeks later, an almost identical incident took place, with even heavier damage done to the wooden vessel. On April 23rd, there was a terrifying near collision near the Second Thomas Shoal caused by a CCG ship blocking a PCG vessel, the BRP Malapuskia. Interestingly, the incident was caught on camera since Malapuskia had a small group of journalists aboard for the 1,038-mile patrol. Inviting journalists to come along as part of the new Philippine strategy to expose China's increasingly hostile actions in the South China Sea. However, public scrutiny didn't seem to deter China, as its Coast Guard carried out another water cannon attack against Philippine vessels a mere week later. This time, China's victims were the BRP Bagachay and a vessel owned by the Philippine Bureau of Fisheries. Although blasted by powerful water jets seeking to severely damage them, these vessels were ordered to stand down to avoid escalation, which is precisely what China wants. Simply put, the Philippines refuse to fall into the Chinese trap. However, this stance has seemingly only angered China and indeed escalated the conflict, leading to the most concerning incident to date, which took place on June 17th. At the time, there was a collision involving a Chinese vessel and Philippine supply ship on a routine mission to the Second Thomas Shoal. The CCG vessel deliberately and continually rammed the supply ship in an effort to forcefully block it from carrying on its mission. The Chinese Coast Guard personnel even boarded this rigid-hulled ship, as well as another vessel accompanying it. Wielding axes and machetes, these individuals started trashing the equipment, as well as seized weapons and mobile phones from the Philippine personnel. It's reported that several Filipino Navy personnel were wounded in the incident, with one of them losing his thumb. This incident undoubtedly marked the culmination of tensions between China and the Philippines, to the point the two nations were forced to hold talks to defuse the situation. But although both sides agreed to de-escalate tensions, China's largest Coast Guard ship, nicknamed the Monster, was once again seen around the Second Thomas Shoal not even a day after the de-escalation talks. The Monster, a 12,000-ton mammoth of a ship, is also the world's largest Coast Guard vessel, and it's been continuously sailing into and through the Philippines' EEZ for months. It's clear that China is adamant about continuing to exert pressure on the Philippines in an effort to subdue the nation. This approach is part of China's broader strategy to kill the chicken to scare the monkey, described The Diplomat, an Asia-Pacific current affairs magazine a decade ago. You see, kill the chicken to scare the monkey is an old Chinese proverb that refers to the strategy of taking small actions against a weaker opponent to intimidate larger and more powerful adversaries. In the context of China's strategy toward the Philippines, the larger, more powerful adversary is, of course, the US. However, the mere fact that China has been losing control and lashing out in the South China Sea suggests that this strategy isn't achieving its intended goal of deterrence and dominance. As things currently stand, not even the Philippines are scared of China. But how is this possible? After all, the situation was much different 10 years ago when the Diplomat first outlined China's now unsuccessful strategy. Well, as it turns out, a lot of things can change in the span of 10 years, or in the case of the Philippines, even in the span of 2 years. You see, 2022 was when a new president of the Philippines was elected, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. Former President Rodrigo Duterte, who led the country between 2016 and 22, was often slammed as a coward, trembling even in the shadow of China's President Xi Jinping. For this reason, Duterte willingly made numerous concessions to China, allegedly even entering into a gentleman's agreement with Xi to keep the status quo in the South China Sea. Duterte even referred to The Hague's official ruling as just a piece of paper, clearly demonstrating who his allegiances were with. It's no wonder, then, that Duterte was labeled as a traitor by many of his subjects who couldn't wait to see him out of office. And that's precisely what happened in 2022 when President Marcos took over with an overwhelming mandate of 31 million votes. Under Marcos's leadership, there was a noticeable shift in the Philippines' foreign policy toward China. Even in the early days of his presidency, Marcos didn't mince words when talking about China's actions in the South China Sea. His rhetoric only grew more powerful the more China grew brazen. In September 2023, speaking at the 43rd ASEAN Summit retreat, Marcos said that the Philippine people seek no conflict, but that it's their duty as citizens and as leaders to always rise to meet any challenge to their sovereignty, to their sovereign rights, and their maritime jurisdictions in the South China Sea. His defense secretary, Gilberto Teodoro Jr., even went further, labeling China as a bully in an interview with CNN the same month. His words painted quite a picture as he described how far China was truly going. It's not the question of stealing your lunch money, but it's really a question of stealing your lunch bag, your chair, and even your enrollment in school. But although this name and shame approach to dealing with China was groundbreaking in its own right, it soon became evident that it was just not enough. Neither were the many protests the Philippines vehemently filed over China's actions. As Marcos puts it, "We have filed over 100 protests. We have already made a similar number of démarches. We have to do more than just that." So the Philippines swapped words with actions. Toward the end of 2023, Marcos approved the 2024 national budget, allocating roughly $4 billion for defense, a massive 40% increase compared to 2023. However, this was just the beginning. In February 2024, Marcos approved a $35 billion military modernization plan, which will allow the Philippines to check all the items off its military procurement wish list over the next 10 years. The money will be primarily spent on strengthening the Philippine Navy, though the Air Force and the Army will also receive their fair share. Although not many details have been shared on the exact content of this wish list, the new Naval Inspector General of the Philippine Navy, Commodore Roy Vincent Trinidad, gave a slight hint by saying, "Our ships or our capabilities, including those on land, should have the capability to fight in the air, on land, on surface, at sea, and subsurface undersea, and of course, in the electronic spectrum." When it comes to the military upgrades that are known, we must mention the M142 High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, the Light Multiple Rocket Launcher better known as HIMARS. This truck-mounted mobile rocket launcher, which can carry 6 missiles at a time, recently saw a massive spike in popularity after being successfully deployed in the war in Ukraine. For the Philippines, this system perfectly complements the SSM-700K Sea-Star ship-launched surface-to-surface cruise missile, enhancing its defense and strike capabilities. Of course, we can't talk about these capabilities without mentioning the BrahMos supersonic cruise missiles the Philippines acquired from India. This medium-range missile can be launched from submarines, ships, and fighter aircraft, and is hailed as the world's fastest supersonic cruise missile, traveling at a speed of Mach 2.8, almost 3 times the speed of sound. Naturally, given its speed, this missile is nearly impossible to intercept by either land or ship-based ballistic missile defense systems. Each BrahMos battery consists of 4 launchers, with 3 missiles with a 180-mile range. So far, the Philippines has acquired 4 of these batteries, the last delivered in April 2024. The first 3 were part of a historic $375 million deal signed between the Philippines and India in 2022. In June 2022, the Philippines built the first base for these missiles, facing the South China Sea. The first base, located in western Luzon, positions these anti-ship cruise missiles to strike targets up to 185 miles away. Of course, the location of the base was expected, as it gave the Philippines a chance to expand its weapons range over the Scarborough Shoal. Now, this doesn't mean the Philippines will start firing BrahMos missiles at Chinese vessels sailing near the shoal. Far from it. But these missiles undoubtedly serve as a powerful deterrence during times of peace. As for wartime, their presence ensures that the Philippines has a formidable means of defense and retaliation, making any aggressive actions by China a much riskier proposition. Now, you might wonder, what can 4 BrahMos batteries possibly do against the mighty Chinese military? And that's a fair question. But let us remind you what a lifesaver a single, locally developed battery, the R360 Neptune, was for Ukraine. The R360 Neptune is, in fact, far inferior to BrahMos. It's much slower, less precise, and has a shorter range. And yet it dealt a devastating blow to the Russian Black Sea Fleet in the early days of the invasion by sinking the 612-foot Moskva, the fleet's flagship and one of the largest surface warships in the entire Russian Navy. In other words, it doesn't take a whole host of missiles to make parts of the ocean too dangerous for any adversary. And if China decides to just bomb the BrahMos bases and eliminate the threat, well, it will have a hard time taking them all out at once. Remember, these launchers are mounted on trucks, so at any sign of danger, they can just flee the scene and relocate to a new position. These new military upgrades have certainly emboldened the Philippines, who grew tired of being pushed around by China. However, this newfound boldness undoubtedly has more to do with the re-establishment of close military ties with the US, one of the first moves Marcos made after winning the presidency. So instead of scaring the US and keeping it away by bullying the Philippines, China only managed to reinforce the military alliance between the two nations. In fact, as of 2024, the US has 9 military bases in the Philippines, with 4 of them added after Marcos became president. These bases include the Antonio Batista Air Base and Balabac Island in the province of Palawan, the Besa Air Base in the province of Pampanga, the Benito Ebuen Air Base in the province of Cebu, Fort Magsaysay in the province of Nueva Ecija, Lumbia Airport in the city of Cagayan de Oro, Camp Melchor de la Cruz in the municipality of Gamu Isabela, Lalo Airport in the municipality of Lalo, Cagayan, and the Naval Base Camilo Asayas in the municipality of Santa Ana, Cagayan. The 4 bases added in 2023 are closer to Taiwan, with one of them also facing the hotly disputed Spratly Islands, which allows the US to project power and maintain stability in the entire Indo-Pacific region. The US has also positioned its ground-based Typhoon mid-range missile system at a military base in Luzon. The US Army Pacific Command referred to this move as a historic first, as this was the first time the US deployed a mid-range missile launcher system in Asia since the Cold War. The Typhoon system is capable of firing SM-6 anti-aircraft missiles with a 150-mile range and Tomahawk land attack missiles with a 1,500-mile range. However, this system is set to return to the US in September 2024, as it was primarily moved to the Philippines for another notable display of strength between the nations, the joint military exercises conducted by the US and the Philippines. The most notable among these is Balikatan, an annual military exercise designed to boost bilateral interoperability and cooperation between the allies. Balikatan is a Filipino word for shoulder to shoulder, which speaks volumes about the solidarity between the US and the Philippines. Balikatan 2024 took place in April and May at various locations throughout the country. Besides the US and the Philippines, Australia and France also sent their service members to train in the country, increasing their collective proficiency in maritime security, aviation and amphibious operations, and information and cyberspace warfare. Representatives of 14 other countries were also there in an observer capacity, underscoring the exercise's significance as a multinational effort to enhance regional security and cooperation. In terms of numbers, over 16,000 military personnel from the 4 participating countries took part in the series of exercises conducted over 19 days. Predictably, China slammed these exercises as deliberate provocations, but also showed signs of being quite alarmed about the ironclad alliance between the US and the Philippines, as it should be. Recently, US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan reiterated the US's commitment to help the Philippines in the event of any armed attacks on Philippine armed forces, public vessels or aircraft, to include those of its Coast Guard anywhere in the South China Sea. Of course, Sullivan's words were a reference to the Mutual Defense Treaty between the US and the Philippines, which calls for immediate assistance in the event of an armed attack on the metropolitan territory of either of the parties, or the island territories under its jurisdiction in the Pacific, or on its armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft in the Pacific. The US is also the only country with which the Philippines has a mutual defense treaty, highlighting the strength of its security partnership in the Pacific region. The US is also working on securing $2.5 billion in military aid over 5 fiscal years, starting with 2025. With all this in mind, it's easy to conclude that the US is undoubtedly the Philippines' biggest ally, and arguably the primary reason why China now fears the nation. However, the Philippines hasn't been putting all its eggs in one basket. Instead, it's pursued a wide range of alliances in the region. That's why the country has established defense alliances with South Korea, Japan, and Australia, and has sought to negotiate a code of conduct with Vietnam and Malaysia. In November 2023, the Philippines signed a new defense cooperation framework with Japan. The framework, known as the Official Security Assistance, aims to deepen security cooperation between the countries, with Japan promising to provide equipment and supplies as well as assistance for the development of infrastructures to the Philippines in view of strengthening its security capacities and improving its deterrence capabilities. As a start, Japan agreed to deliver 4 TPS P-14ME radars manufactured by Mitsubishi Electric Corporation to the Philippines, 2 of which have already reached their destination. Meanwhile, Australia recently announced it would spend $26 million on enhancing its maritime partnerships in the Indo-Pacific region. As part of this pledge, the country tapped the Philippines to conduct the first joint sea and air patrols in the South China Sea in November 2023. During the same month, the Philippines and South Korea agreed to enhance their mutual defense cooperation. This informal agreement came after the Philippine Air Force had already acquired 12 South Korean-made F-A-50 fighter jets, while the Philippine Navy received its first 2 missile frigates. In the coming years, South Korea is expected to deliver 2 more corvettes and 6 offshore patrol vessels. By now, we can safely conclude that the Philippines isn't playing around with its security. The new Philippines under Marcos's guidance has shown remarkable resistance, but also equally impressive restraint in dealing with the incessant threats from China. As Marcos himself puts it, the Philippines is not in the business to instigate wars. Our great ambition is to provide a peaceful and prosperous life for every Filipino. But is peace truly possible in the Indo-Pacific region? Will the Philippines' growing confidence deter China from making rash decisions, or will it only escalate tensions further? China's plan to invade the relatively small yet globally significant island of Taiwan may be hitting a major roadblock. The Philippines, backed by the US, could influence China's invasion plans in a major China-Taiwan conflict. But what is it about the Philippines that makes them play such a pivotal role in this scenario? In the year 2023, Taiwan became the most strategically important piece of real estate on Earth. This de facto independent island nation 110 miles off the coast of the Chinese mainland sits at the center of the world's economic and geopolitical fault lines. Since it came to power in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party has regarded Taiwan as a renegade province, a relic left over from its long civil war and the century of humiliation it climaxed. This was the period between 1839 and 1949, where China repeatedly found itself invaded, defeated, occupied, and partitioned by foreign powers. Taiwan's self-governing status is a reminder to the Chinese leadership of those times, and reunifying it with the mainland is one of the most important objectives for China's authoritarian leader, Xi Jinping, who hopes that the process will be completed by 2049, the centennial of the Chinese Communist Party's ascendancy to power. There are many obstacles to this plan, but one of them is not so often cited: the Philippines. Let's take a look at the Philippines, its tense relationship with China, and how this nation threatens Beijing's grandest foreign policy ambition. Taiwan is important to the Chinese leadership not just for historical reasons, but because of its economic and geostrategic position. Economically, Taiwan hosts the world's most advanced semiconductor industry through the dominance of one company, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC. In 2021, Taiwan had 63% of the world's semiconductor market share, with 54% of the world total being through TSMC alone. These chips are at the heart of the world's digital economy and power everything from computers to the brake sensors in cars. For China, gaining control of this industry would be very desirable. Placing itself at the heart of the globe's high-technology supply chain has been a major priority for its geopolitical strategy, as seen in its Made in China 2025 plan. If the semiconductor shortage of the past few years made things more expensive, Beijing getting to dictate the supply chain of these vital components would increase the price tag of almost everything much further. Geopolitically, Taiwan also sits at the center of the First Island Chain, the series of islands that span from Japan to Indonesia. These islands act as a natural obstacle to China's expansion into the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Restoring Taiwan to Beijing's rule would break this chain and allow China to freely access the world's oceans without having to go through the choke points that the First Island Chain presents, such as the Strait of Malacca or the Miyako Strait. Controlling these choke points is one of the United States Navy's principal strategies for containing Chinese military expansion. If China were to take Taiwan, however, it would have the land and ports it needs to bypass those choke points, making containment much more difficult, if not impossible. The United States is Taiwan's most important potential ally. Officially, America treats Taiwan with a doctrine of strategic ambiguity, neither confirming nor denying that it would come to the island's defense if it were to be invaded. But under the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, it has long sold sophisticated weapons to the island nation to deter such an invasion from happening. With this equipment, Taiwan has pursued what it calls a porcupine strategy, fortifying itself as heavily as possible and building offensive assets to deal damage to the Chinese mainland, all to increase the costs China would incur for an invasion and hold out as long as it can while it awaits the aid of its allies. Japan would also play an important role in the defense of Taiwan. In December 2021, the late former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said the United States and Japan would not be able to stand idly by if Taiwan were attacked. In 2022, only a few months before his shocking assassination, he urged the United States to drop strategic ambiguity and affirmatively say it would defend Taiwan. A Taiwan contingency is a Japan contingency, he said, because China establishing air superiority around Taiwan would cover Japanese airspace. A takeover of Taiwan would also allow China to threaten Japanese shipping even more than it does today with its militarization of the South China Sea. Japan is a resource-poor nation and must import raw materials and commodities to survive. It cannot allow China to dictate what goes on in the region's shipping lanes. However, for all the talk about Japan and its role in a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan, far fewer people talk about the role the Philippines would play in such a scenario. Thanks to a renewed agreement with the United States, this is starting to change, and Taiwan may soon be able to count on the aid of the Philippines as it stares down the colossus across the strait. The Philippines, though much smaller than the United States and Japan, also has a keen interest in seeing that Taiwan does not become subject to the Chinese Communist Party, and the Philippines has now become a major player in the dispute over Taiwan. The entrance of the Philippines into the Taiwan question is a natural consequence of the diplomatic and military rivalry between it and China, which has occurred in the last decade. The Philippines and China have long had a bitter dispute over the waters of the South China Sea. In 2012, China seized control of the Scarborough Shoal, a rock with valuable fishing sites and hydrocarbon reserves that rests within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. It was the start of a conflict between China and the Philippines over several rocks and island chains in the South China Sea. Other points of contention between the two nations include Mischief Reef and the Spratly Islands, all of which China went on to occupy and fortify. The Philippines brought a suit in international court, and in 2016, a tribunal in The Hague ruled that all of China's territorial claims in the South China Sea, based on a 9-dash line map drawn in the late 1940s, had no legal basis. Still, China ignored the ruling and occupies these rocks and islands to this day. China's aggressive policy in the area has naturally alienated the Philippines, which is a long-time ally of the United States. The United States has had bases throughout the Philippines since the Spanish-American War of 1898, but its presence is now starting to expand much more. The Filipino military is not a formidable fighting force, meaning that China has mostly been able to get its way in its disputes with the Philippines, despite the international tribunals ruling against it. The Philippines has an active army of about 100,000 active duty personnel, a navy with only a few vessels more fit for fighting than patrol boats, and about 25 combat aircraft. This means that militarily, the Philippines would contribute little to the defense of Taiwan, at least for now. However, the Philippines does have two advantages: its geographical position and its alliance with the United States, which it has now begun to ramp up ties with again after a period of frostier relations. In 2014, as the South China Sea dispute began to ramp up, the United States and the Philippines signed the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA. Under the terms of the EDCA, the United States would be able to expand its military presence in the Philippines, although the 2014 document did not specifically state where it would do this. Rather, the document only affirmed the principle that the armed forces of the Philippines would provide new locations for the United States Armed Forces. In 2016, 5 such locations were formally announced. These were, from north to south, Fort Magsaysay in Nueva Ecija, Besa Air Base in Pampanga, Mactan Benito Ebuen Air Base in Cebu, Antonio Bautista Air Base, and Lumbia Air Base in Cagayan de Oro. Of the 2016 locations, Antonio Bautista Air Base was the most important, as it was close to the disputed Spratly Islands in the South China Sea. However, as China's military buildup in the region has only grown since 2016, the United States and Philippines announced plans to further accelerate the EDCA in February 2023. In April, the Pentagon announced the creation of 4 new EDCA bases. These are Naval Base Camilo Osayas in Santa Ana, Cagayan, Camp Melchor de la Cruz in Gamu, Isabela, Balabac Island in Palawan, and Laulo Airport in Cagayan. Not coincidentally, 3 of these 4 locations are in the northern Philippines, which makes the intentions of that expansion clear. The new bases are to help deter a potential invasion of Taiwan by allowing the United States to more easily project power into a critical area, the Luzon Strait. The Luzon Strait is one of the first island chain's strategic choke points. It is a 160-mile gap of water between the Philippines and Taiwan. The Philippines' northernmost island, Mavulis, is even closer, at only 118 miles away from the world's most disputed hotspot. Here is where we see the role that the Philippines would play in the defense of the world's most hotly contested island. In the first place, the bases give the United States and its regional allies additional options to choke off shipping to China. As China is heavily dependent on foreign food and energy imports, this is something that the country's leadership will need to take seriously and helps aid the process of deterrence. Geographically, the bases strengthen a potential new front to counter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan if deterrence fails and hostilities actually become a reality. In the necessary amphibious operation, China would now likely be facing a pincer movement of forces moving south from Japan and north from the Philippines, adding to the already immense difficulty of pulling off a successful waterborne maneuver and establishing a beachhead across the Strait of Taiwan. An amphibious invasion is hard enough. An amphibious invasion that would need to fend off American and Allied forces on 2 sides that would be almost impossible, especially with a lack of surprise on the invaders' side. The bases also better prepare the United States and its other allies in the region, such as its Quad partners Japan and Australia, for war. Their locations make them ideal places to stage military exercises simulating an invasion of Taiwan. Although there is no true substitute for actual combat operations, the better prepared military force will usually get the better of an engagement, something the Chinese brass should know well, since the principle goes all the way back to Sun Tzu. The new bases in the Philippines certainly increase the preparation the United States and its allies can make for a coming invasion. The renewed military partnership between the United States and the Philippines also offers the prospect of improving that country's military readiness as well, which, as we have seen, is badly needed. As China's policy in the region has routinely seen the Philippines bullied, it is likely that policymakers in Manila will want to take advantage of the opportunity that the new bases provide. Indeed, the United States and the Philippines have already conducted drills in the Luzon Strait, which will lead to improved Filipino readiness in the long run. Someday soon, the Philippines could join joint exercises not only with the United States, but with its partners in the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, Japan, Australia, and possibly even India. The new bases in the Philippines also help to reduce one of China's major advantages, which had been eroding the United States' share of the military balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region. Namely, the bases help to mitigate the tyranny of distance. This term describes the disadvantage the United States would face by fighting thousands of miles away from its homeland. It would need to ship troops, supplies, and other essentials over those thousands of miles of ocean, where China's troops and supplies would only need to travel a little bit from their homeland. The vast distance also has a negative effect on morale at the home front, because it makes Americans wonder what the war is really about. This was a big factor in contributing to the political controversies in America's interventions in Vietnam and Iraq, and it is a tradition that goes back to the earliest days of the country's history. With China's development of anti-access area denial (A2AD) capabilities, the tyranny of distance has magnified. The long American supply lines would make ripe targets for China's A2AD strategy. But the bases in the Philippines give the United States more options. It can now position many more assets close to the area where the fighting over Taiwan would be taking place, making China's A2AD harder to carry out. For example, China has an arsenal of thousands of ballistic missiles that threatens all of America's bases in the region. But the more targets there are to hit, and the more air defense systems get concentrated along the bases, the faster China's missile depletion becomes. Some of the missiles will hit, but the bases in the Philippines mean that now China has more targets to hit and more air defense systems to deal with. The bases in the Philippines ultimately mean the attrition math will shift more in favor of the United States and its allies, even though they would still take terrible damage in an all-out Chinese missile attack. Still, surviving assets can more confidently be brought forward to act when the reign of missiles ends. In this way, the new bases in the Philippines are in line with the United States' third offset strategy, which it codified in the mid-2010s. Meanwhile, the new base means that the United States will be able to position more assets that can hit the Chinese mainland too, further undermining China's A2AD strategy and increasing the costs of a conflict exponentially and further aiding deterrence. The agreement with the Philippines, however, prohibits the deployment of nuclear weapons in the bases. So the EDCA is not a nuclear umbrella type of agreement. That is one of the few items of solace for the Chinese leadership. For the Philippines, the renewal and expansion of the EDCA marks a return to its traditional close relationship with the United States. Despite the territorial disputes in the South China Sea, Rodrigo Duterte, president of the Philippines from 2016 to 2022, flirted with forging closer relations with China in order to reduce the country's dependence on the United States. His successor, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., has proven more traditional in pursuing the Philippines' alliance with the United States. The new base also includes an investment worth over $82 million for infrastructure and access to resources for those bases. This investment will be a good source of jobs for local Filipino residents, meaning that they aid the United States not only in its projection of military power, but economic influence. Therefore, aside from the military balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region, the bases also affect one of the cornerstones of Chinese policy: economic coercion. China has long used its financial and industrial power to exert leverage over the domestic politics of other nations. We have even witnessed this in action in the United States, with certain Hollywood filmmakers carefully curating their content to not offend Chinese sensibilities, and the 2019 controversy in the NBA about the fate of Hong Kong, which was erupting with protests at the time. The effects are far more profound elsewhere. For example, China has used its economic leverage over many Muslim-majority nations to buy their silence regarding the treatment of its Muslim Uyghur population in its western Xinjiang province, which the United States State Department, the British Parliament, and several other governments around the world have formally classified as genocide. China's infrastructure investments through its Belt and Road Initiative, among other projects, have also given it leverage over countries receiving the funds. Although the Philippines is technically a member of the Belt and Road Initiative, its Chinese-sponsored infrastructure development there has only been limited and is highly controversial among the Filipino public. Despite China's attempts to make inroads, the United States and its respective companies remain the heaviest source of foreign investment in the Philippines. The situation has limited the Chinese government's ability to exert economic coercion over that country. In the past, Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership could have hoped to buy at least the neutrality of the Philippines concerning the Taiwan issue, but with the new bases and both the military and economic ties that it brings with the United States, this possibility just got sharply reduced. The failure of China to bring the Philippines into its orbit, despite the 6 years of friendly Duterte presidency, severely threatens Beijing's plans for Taiwan. Geographically, the Philippines is just too important to the success or failure of an operation to take the island. The Philippines now actively coming onto the side of the United States makes the already difficult operation even more difficult for China, and the problem is only likely to get worse for Beijing. Unlike China, the Philippines is increasing in population. It is expected to increase from the current 117 million to about 180 million by the end of the century. Meanwhile, China's population peaked in about 2020 and is now declining. It is expected to shrink from 1.4 billion to about 776 million by the end of the century. The Philippines' economy is growing as well, with an average annual GDP growth of 6.4% since 1990. As the Philippines' population economy grows, it will be an even better source for American investment, and the new wealth will give the Philippines the opportunity to expand its military power in the future. Add this reality to China's economic and demographic problems, and the window for the mainland to reunify with the island through use of force might be closing rapidly. Unsurprisingly, the Chinese government was not happy about the renewal of the EDCA and the expansion of American military bases and financial investment in the Philippines. When the news came, the Chinese Foreign Ministry accused the United States and Philippines of increasing tension in the region and helping to destabilize it. For the Philippines, though, there is little choice but to strengthen its ties with the United States. As another country in the first island chain, it would be even more subjected to China's whims if it took control of Taiwan. Just like Japan, its airspace would be under threat if China controlled the skies over Taiwan. Its shipping and maritime commerce, already under stress from China's occupation of strategic real estate in the South China Sea, would be that much more inhibited. When seen in this light, it was probably foolish for the Chinese leadership to believe that the Philippines would ever come under its orbit to the extent that countries in the Eurasian interior would. In the affairs of nations, security considerations will almost always win out over economic considerations. Because of its geopolitical position, the Philippines cannot let China secure a hegemonic position in the Indo-Pacific region, which it would do if Taiwan were to fall. Therefore, it is in the interest of the Philippines to forge ties with and host the military of the only nation that can prevent such a thing from happening, the United States. China may have thought time was on its side, but the renewal of the EDCA might just mean that by 2049, China will be unable to attempt an invasion of Taiwan, let alone actually succeed in its plan. But what do you think? Do the new American bases in the Philippines shift the region's balance of power and threaten China's plans to invade Taiwan? If so, how heavily?
It's widely believed that a full-scale Chinese invasion of Taiwan is just a matter of time. Some military experts see this invasion happening soon, in fact next year, 2025, as that's how long they predict it will take China to get ready. Others place the date during the 2030s, as this is when the US may become less dependent on Taiwan's semiconductors and thus potentially abandon its protégé. The third group seems to think that the year 2049, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, could be the perfect opportunity to take action on the One China policy. But what if we told you that China won't invade Taiwan in 2025, 2030, or 2039, or ever for that matter? That's right. The incessant barrage of warnings about Taiwan's precarious future might sound alarming, but it doesn't always align with the complexities of real-world decision-making. In fact, these warnings overlook key factors that will deter China from launching a full-scale invasion. What are these factors, you might ask? Stick around, and that's precisely what you'll find out. But we can't just jump straight into these factors without first understanding the broader context of the Taiwan-China relationship and the complexities involved. So let's take a step back and consider the historical and economic factors that play into this dynamic before delving into the specific reasons why a Chinese invasion of Taiwan may not be as imminent as some fear. Taiwan started out as an ancestral home to the Taiwanese indigenous people, who settled on the island some 6,000 years ago. However, in the 17th century, China annexed this island during the Qing dynasty. Taiwan stayed under Chinese rule until 1895, when it was ceded to the Empire of Japan after China suffered a devastating defeat at the hands of the Japanese military. If World War II had never happened, Taiwan would likely still be under Japanese control. Unfortunately, this war did happen, and the island was handed back to China in 1945, this time for good. Or was it? Just a few short years later, in 1949, the brutal Chinese Civil War ended in the defeat of the nationalist government, led by General Chiang Kai-shek, by the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong. As a result, the nationalist government fled to Taiwan to avoid persecution and, let's face it, execution. Once in the clear, the exiled government continued to claim sovereignty from China, including the mainland. Mainland China, on the other hand, considered Taiwan to be part of its territory that needed to be reunified with the mainland by force if necessary. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Interestingly, the rest of the world backed Taiwan at first, or the Republic of China to be precise. This mostly had to do with Mao's ruthless rule, which turned China into somewhat of an outcast on the global stage. However, this support didn't last long. In 1971, the United Nations cut diplomatic ties with Taiwan, taking away its official seat at the UN Security Council. This seat was, in turn, given to Mao's PRC as the sole representative of China. Unsurprisingly, others followed suit, switching their diplomatic recognition from the ROC to the PRC. This trend has become so massive that today only a dozen or so countries recognize Taiwan as a sovereign state. However, this diplomatic isolation didn't diminish Taiwan's determination to assert its sovereignty, and that's precisely what it did for the most part, enjoying de facto independence and developing into a prosperous and democratic society. Today, as many as 67% of this society sees itself as Taiwanese, a record high number. Another 28% see themselves as both Taiwanese and Chinese, while only a paltry 3% identify as primarily Chinese. But how Taiwan and its people see themselves was never the issue. Mainland China's assertions were. Though to be fair, even mainland China agreed to a peaceful period following the economic boom of the 1980s. However, this period would abruptly end in 2016 when Taiwan elected its first female president, Tsai Ing-wen. Unlike the previous administration, Tsai and her Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, had no interest in adhering to the One China principle. This departure from the status quo led to increased tensions between Taiwan and mainland China, with Beijing viewing Tsai's presidency as a challenge to its sovereignty claims over Taiwan. So since 2016, the situation between mainland China and Taiwan has been tense, with no resolution. Each new incident just seems to add fuel to the fire, escalating the conflict to new heights of hostility and brinksmanship. So far, the hottest that this fire has gotten was in August 2022, when the US House of Representatives Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. This move made the PRC seemingly lose all of its cool, if it ever had any restraint, and sent its military to perform a series of live-fire drills that lasted for nearly a week. During these drills, the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, fired at least 11 ballistic missiles in Taiwan's direction. It also sent over 200 military aircraft and over 50 warships to menace the island. But that's not all. Dozens of these military aircraft crossed the median line in the Taiwan Strait, which is considered the unofficial sea border between Taiwan and China. This meant that the PRC came closer to Taiwan than it ever had before, transforming a 12 nautical mile zone around Taiwan into a full-on war zone. A similar, though slightly less dramatic reaction took place in 2023 after Pelosi's successor, Kevin McCarthy, hosted Taiwan's president in California. This time, the PRC sent 14 warplanes and 3 warships to the vicinity of Taiwan, simulating an attack and a blockade of the island. But why stop at simulating these actions? Why not simply continue full steam ahead and invade Taiwan? Mainland China's apparent reluctance to engage in a direct military confrontation with Taiwan can be attributed to a variety of factors, including economic, military, and logistical ones. These factors are also the reasons we believe China won't ever invade Taiwan. So let's break them down. First up, the economic reasons. Typically, economic interests are among the leading reasons for an invasion, as the invading country seeks to gain access to new markets, resources, trade routes, and labor force. Let's not sugarcoat it. China would immensely benefit from such access, as the country is still struggling to recover following the COVID-19 pandemic, with its gross domestic product (GDP) growth rate falling under 5% in 2024. But in reality, China's invasion of Taiwan would bring the nation significantly more harm than good in this department. Let's explain. You see, Taiwan is a major technological power, dominating the global market of semiconductors. Over 60% of all global semiconductors are produced on the almost 14,000 square miles of territory that is Taiwan. Even more impressive, this figure climbs to over 90% when discussing the most advanced semiconductors used in cutting-edge technologies like artificial intelligence, 5G networks, and electric vehicles. Though China also produces these highly valuable resources, its manufacturing capabilities are nowhere near Taiwan's. That's why China is one of Taiwan's biggest semiconductor importers. Not only that, but semiconductors are also China's biggest import overall, narrowly surpassing crude oil. In 2023, the country imported almost $350 billion worth of semiconductors, while importing almost $340 billion worth of crude oil. This means that China would take a massive hit if Taiwan's microchip exports were to halt, and this is precisely what would happen in the case of an invasion. Some experts even believe that Taiwan would deliberately destroy its manufacturing facilities if invaded to prevent China from seizing control of them. If this were to happen, the effects on the global industries would be nothing short of catastrophic. According to a US Department of Defense study, taking Taiwan out of the semiconductor equation means wiping $2.5 trillion from the global GDP over the course of a year. The result, one of the worst economic crises in modern history. And let's not forget, China's most advanced weapons rely on microchips. The PLA will hardly be able to fly its high-tech drones and missiles without a stable supply of Taiwanese semiconductors. Now, you might wonder, could China simply amp up its semiconductor production and replace Taiwan's output? In theory, it could. After all, China has made significant strides in this area, decreasing its dependency on Taiwan by almost 11% from 2022 to 23. However, this endeavor would take an immense amount of effort for years, if not decades, and billions of dollars. And China can't afford to waste any of these resources. But let's say China finds a way to either replace Taiwan's semiconductor output or seize the country's reserves. Would this mean an invasion is inevitable? Absolutely not. After all, we've only gone over the economic reasons preventing a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Now it's time for the military ones. For some background information, China is considered the third strongest military power in the world, according to the Global Firepower Index. Taiwan is number 24. So how could there possibly be military reasons stopping China from invading Taiwan? There absolutely could be when the number one military force in the world stands in your way. That's right, the US's involvement in East Asia is arguably the strongest deterrent to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And the US's protection of Taiwan isn't something that's just implied or assumed. It's backed by the Taiwan Relations Act and the Taiwan Enhanced Resilience Act, which mandate the US to provide Taiwan with the means to defend itself in the case of an invasion. But to make matters worse for China, the US isn't waiting for the worst-case scenario to happen to start arming Taiwan. In 2023, shortly after the PLA's theatrics in the South China Sea, the US State Department approved the first-ever military aid package to Taiwan worth up to $345 million. Best of all, this package is just the beginning. Under the Taiwan Enhanced Resilience Act, the US government is authorized to spend up to $2 billion on Taiwan's military grant assistance each year from 2023 to 27. Talk about a military buildup. Of course, these moves come as a direct response to China's record-high military buildup in the region, which could allow the country to launch a full-scale invasion of Taiwan. But military equipment isn't all that the US is providing to Taiwan. This military superpower is also stationing troops all over and around the island. Out of the top 3 countries with the highest number of active duty US troops overseas, 2 are in the vicinity of Taiwan, Japan and South Korea. With over 53,000 troops, Japan has the highest concentration of active duty US forces overseas. South Korea is in third place with over 24,000 troops. Other notable locations in the region include Guam and Singapore. These figures mean only one thing: if an invasion was to take place, the US could reinforce Taiwan virtually overnight. This brings us to the other countries that might be prepared to counter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. However, most of these countries wouldn't act solely as US allies, not when some of them have also been wronged by China on multiple occasions. Take Japan as an example. The country has a complex relationship with China, packed with historical grievances and territorial disputes, so much so that China has repeatedly been labeled as the greatest strategic challenge for Japan. The challenges posed by China's growing military might in the Pacific have also prompted Japan to abandon decades of pacifism and boost its military capabilities, and what a boost it's been. In 2023 alone, Japan unveiled a plan to invest a staggering $320 billion into its military equipment. With this 5-year plan, once unthinkable in this pacifist nation, Japan will shoot right to the top of the list of the biggest military spenders in the world. Japan is also an instrumental actor in the so-called First Island chain, much of which is situated in waters claimed by China. But why does this chain matter in a potential China versus Taiwan battle? Because the chain, stretching from Japan to the Philippines, acts as a natural barrier that could impede China's naval access to the Pacific Ocean and, in turn, Taiwan. Better yet, most of the countries in the First Island chain have a vested interest in preventing Taiwan's invasion, so they're sure to take full advantage of this strategic position. But what other countries are we talking about? Primarily the Philippines. Like Japan, this country has had its fair share of geopolitical tensions with China, particularly regarding territorial claims in the South China Sea. So it's no wonder the Philippines has strengthened its defense ties with the US, allowing this country to store its military supplies in Philippine bases. At the moment, the US has access to 9 of these bases, most of which are positioned in the north, allowing it to continue the First Island chain further down the South China Sea. However, the First Island chain isn't the only deterrent to China in the South China Sea. So are Australia's nuclear-powered attack submarines, or they will be soon. Australia is purchasing these submarines from the US and the UK under the AUKUS security partnership between the 3 countries. Officially, Australia is getting these submarines to strengthen its naval fleet. Unofficially, it's to deter any Chinese move against Taiwan. And what a deterrence these submarines can be! Australia is getting between 3 and 5 Virginia-class attack submarines, the US Navy's newest undersea warfare capability. These submarines are designed to seek and destroy both enemy submarines and surface vessels. 2 factors make them a particularly powerful deterrent against China. 1, they're exceptionally difficult to track and eliminate, and 2, they can be equipped with nuclear warheads. Better yet, these Virginia-class attack submarines are just the beginning. Australia is actually working on producing a new class of submarines, the SSN AUKUS class, which will send a clear message to any potential aggressor. Australia is serious about defending and maintaining peace and stability in the region. However, it's also important to note that Australia has never officially promised to help the US defend Taiwan. Moreover, some experts believe that there are no 100% guarantees that any of the mentioned nations would commit to sending troops and military equipment to defend Taiwan. So does this mean China could have a clear path to invasion after all? Not quite. Even if Taiwan was standing all alone against China, this invasion would still be a formidable challenge for the aggressor. But why? Due to many military and logistical impediments. Military-wise, China hasn't fought a war in decades. Interestingly, the country's last war effort was another invasion, or an attempt at an invasion to be precise. The so-called Sino-Vietnamese War lasted for about a month and concluded with China withdrawing its troops in March 1979. This means that China hasn't tested out its military readiness in a large-scale conflict for quite a while. Taiwan, on the other hand, has been preparing for the possibility of this conflict virtually its entire existence. This brings us to another often overlooked deterrence factor: Taiwan's strength. Even if China had no internal military issues, invading Taiwan certainly wouldn't be a walk in the park. Despite its relatively small size, Taiwan has maintained a well-trained and, thanks to the US, well-equipped military, laser-focused on defending its territory against a potential invasion. And Taiwan isn't showing any signs of slowing down. In 2023 alone, it ordered $1.8 billion in equipment and weapons from the US. Here's a brief breakdown of what that amount of money brought in. $619 million worth of modern air warfare missiles, $500 million worth of F-16 infrared search and track systems, $332 million worth of ammunition and technical assistance, $300 million worth of services under command, control, communications, and computers C4 life support cycle, $108 million worth of spares and repair parts for weapons and wheeled vehicles. As you can tell, Taiwan isn't playing any games, and its military budget is only expected to rise. But let's say China chooses to disregard all of this and proceed with the invasion. After all, China is still immensely more powerful than Taiwan in the military department. Its military would surely guarantee a victory. Not quite. Taiwan is defended by another powerful factor, its geography. It seems that even Mother Nature is Taiwan's ally. Let's go over all the factors that make a potential invasion of Taiwan nothing short of a logistical nightmare. First things first, this invasion would have to be a primarily amphibious assault, since Taiwan is an island. These types of assault are already more complex than traditional land invasions due to the need for specialized equipment and exceptional coordination. In fact, a single missing element is enough to botch the entire operation. Unfortunately for China, it's quite easy to mess things up when you're looking at a collection of over 100 islands to account for and secure. Plus, let's not forget that most of these islands are heavily armed with artillery and covered in impregnable military defense posts. And that's just the islands. To get to them, China would have to cross the incredibly choppy Taiwan Strait, the 100-mile-wide stretch of water separating the two countries. To make matters worse, the country's military could only do so during specific periods of the year, as two monsoon seasons, high tidal waves, typhoons, and other extreme weather events don't leave much of a window. But it's not like China can decide overnight to take advantage of fair weather. After all, it would have to transport hundreds of thousands of soldiers across the Taiwan Strait first. Sure, Taiwan might have a little over 200,000 active duty personnel, but it would take China at least 4 to 5 times more personnel to secure a seamless victory. This operation would likely have to be even larger than the D-Day operation of World War II, the largest amphibious invasion in military history. The D-Day operation involved 7,000 vessels and almost 200,000 troops crossing the 100-mile English Channel. It took over 3 weeks for all of the 850,000 troops to land on the beaches of Normandy to liberate France. With China's invasion of Taiwan, we're potentially talking about 1 million soldiers crossing the Taiwan Strait, and China has nowhere near the number of ships necessary to pull this endeavor off. Even if Beijing were to turn to merchant and other civilian ships, things wouldn't get much better. After all, these ships are more vulnerable and take significantly longer to unload. All this ruckus would give Taiwan plenty of time to erect barriers, target the incoming ships, and secure the potential landing site with massive amounts of troops. Speaking of the landing sites, China wouldn't have much luck there either. Taiwan only has a few deep-water ports and beaches that could accommodate a large landing force. Other landing sites feature incredibly shallow water that would require China to anchor its ships far away and gradually transport the equipment and troops to the shores. Whichever of these two scenarios Chinese vessels choose, the results will be the same. Taiwanese troops, artillery, and missiles will be waiting for them. But let's give China the benefit of the doubt and say it manages to overcome this obstacle as well. After struggling to establish a beachhead in Taiwan, China would face another powerful enemy, the island's mountainous terrain. Virtually the entire coastal shoreline of eastern Taiwan is covered in mountains, with some peaks reaching over 12,000 feet. If China wants to secure these wild regions, it would likely have to engage in guerrilla warfare with Taiwanese troops, who are very familiar with the terrain, and they know precisely how to defend it. Even if the Chinese troops somehow manage to survive these treacherous woods and mountains, it wouldn't be the end of their struggles. From guerrilla warfare, they would quickly have to transition into urban warfare to take Taipei. After all, the only way to seize full control over the island is to capture its capital. Unsurprisingly, this task would also be nearly impossible. There are only a few routes leading into Taipei, and the Taiwanese military would likely destroy them to prevent a rapid Chinese advance. The Chinese troops that do manage to make it through are looking at incredibly slow street-by-street fighting that would turn this invasion into a prolonged and bloody conflict. This challenging, expensive, and uncertain invasion sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? This leads us to arguably the biggest reason why China won't invade Taiwan: Russia's fiasco in Ukraine. Do you see the parallels? One of the most powerful countries in the world goes against a much smaller neighbor and expects a clear victory. Yet it's met with fierce resistance and bogged down in a protracted conflict with significant economic and diplomatic repercussions. And let's be honest, Taiwan has an even better logistical advantage than Ukraine. Sure, they would both have home court advantage, but as you heard in the video, Taiwan's mountainous terrain and densely populated urban areas are seemingly ready to join the resistance. Plus, Taiwan has been preparing for a possible Chinese invasion for what seems like forever, backing these efforts with generations of sophisticated and powerful weapons from the US. That's not to mention all the direct support Taiwan has from the US and potentially other countries like the UK, Germany, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines. Sure, Ukraine received tons of military aid, but no country has openly pledged to defend it like Taiwan. This makes war in Ukraine a cautionary tale for China. The country was able to see firsthand how powerful the US is as an ally. Now imagine how powerful it would be as an adversary. This leads us to a simple conclusion. The Ukrainian scenario and the US military's superiority are holding China back. The country realized that any attempt to invade Taiwan would likely result in a prolonged, costly, and ultimately unsuccessful conflict. Even if China somehow managed to win this ill-conceived war, it would be a Pyrrhic victory. Basically, China is looking at a lose-lose scenario. That's probably why China's President Xi Jinping has taken on a peacekeeping role on the global stage, well, at least officially. In April 2023, he even offered a 12-point peace plan for Ukraine and welcomed French President Emmanuel Macron and European Commission Chairman Ursula von der Leyen to Beijing to discuss the war. Just a few days later, Taiwan's former president Ma Ying-jeou visited mainland China, becoming the first current or former Taiwanese leader to do so since 1949. During his visit, he spoke of the common inheritance of blood, language, history, and culture between China and Taiwan. Trampling all over these diplomatic victories and stumbling into a costly war would be incredibly foolish on Xi's part. But then again, stranger things have happened. So while a Chinese invasion of Taiwan isn't likely to happen, it shouldn't be entirely dismissed as a possibility. Here are just a few factors that could trigger China's decision to invade Taiwan after all. Number 1. A perception of US weakness. The outcome of the war in Ukraine, as well as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, can severely impact how the US is perceived globally. In addition, these conflicts have the potential to strain the country's military arsenal substantially, affecting its ability to respond to other global crises adequately. Number 2. The US-Taiwan relationship. Now, numerous different factors within this relationship can affect China's decision-making. Beijing might decide to launch a full-scale invasion if high-ranking US officials continue visiting Taiwan, or if Taiwan keeps purchasing exorbitant amounts of weapons from the US and perhaps even testing them, or if there's a clear shift in the US's Taiwan policy, such as a formal declaration of support for Taiwanese independence. And number 3, the one factor that has nothing to do with the US, President Xi's health. You see, there are some speculations that China's president might not be in the best health. If these are true, he might want to secure his legacy by finally reunifying China before it's too late. But what do you think? Are any of these reasons enough to trigger an invasion of Taiwan, considering what China is up against? And if you agree that this invasion isn't going to happen, which deterrent do you believe to be the strongest?
May 9th, 2024. Japan's defense ministry releases a report which it makes available to the United States, claiming that its maritime self-defense force detected the presence of several Chinese ships near Yokosuka Naval Base. Those ships included a Type 815G named Tianquanjing, a Chinese naval surveillance vessel, in addition to a pair of warships, the Type 054A Changzhou and the Type 056 Luan. All were traveling together, following a route that took them through the Philippine Sea into the East China Sea, and far too close for comfort to a naval base that Japan and the United States share. Japan had to respond. And it did so by sending out ships of its own to intercept the Chinese Navy, marking one of several bold moves that Japan has been taking in recent years to slow down Beijing's maritime ambitions. What are those moves? That's the question we'll explore in this video as we examine what Japan is doing to stop the Chinese Navy from dominating the Indo-Pacific. First, let's come back to our story of the interception. Newsweek reports that the 3 Chinese ships were likely on their way back to China after completing naval exercises in the Indo-Pacific. Each could represent a threat to Japan. Take the Type 815G as an example. Built by Hudong Shipyard, the ship was first deployed into the South China Sea in 2010 and is 130 feet long by about 23 feet wide. It's highlighted by a main tower, above which lies facilities for navigation and, crucially, observation. The ship is capable of traveling up to 21 knots, which is about the same speed as a large landing ship, and can stay at sea for about 50 days before needing to return to port. At its rear lies a helicopter landing position that's suitable for either a Ka-28 or Z-19 carrier helicopter. Beyond that, little is known about the ship, besides the fact that it exists to gather intelligence.
It houses an array of radar domes, which are visible from its deck and contain antennas capable of analyzing communications and missile telemetry signals. In other words, it's the perfect ship for China to use if it wants to get close to a naval base so it can intercept classified communication. Then there are the two warships that accompanied the spying vessel. The Type 054A is just under 440 feet long and is capable of traveling at speeds up to 28 knots. It features a flight deck, which includes a hangar for a single helicopter, as well as several radar and sonar units. But perhaps the most notable thing about it is the sheer volume of munitions it carries. Sea Forces Online reports that the ship is home to a HAKJ-16 vertical launching system containing 32 cells, which can be loaded with China's HQ-16 medium-range anti-air missiles or its Yu-8 torpedoes. Add to that 8 box launchers capable of firing YJ-83 anti-ship missiles, a 76mm gun, and 4 30mm close-in weapon systems or CIWS, and you get a ship that packs a serious punch. A punch strong enough to protect a spy ship while it's gathering information. The Type 056 is a little less powerful. It's a 291-foot-long ship capable of traveling at 25 knots, and it contains a flight deck for a Z-9 helicopter. The ship has an 8-cell launcher from which it can fire short-range HQ-10 anti-air missiles, along with a pair of 2-cell tube launchers that fire the same YJ-83 anti-ship missiles found on the Type 054A. Add to that a 76mm gun, a pair of triple torpedo tubes, and 2 30mm CIWS, and you got a ship that packs less firepower than the Type 054A, but can still be a major threat when used in a supporting role. All three of these ships passed within Japan's territorial waters, moving through its southwestern islands in May 2024. Japan's response was almost immediate. Newsweek reports that it ran an interception operation to essentially guide the Chinese ships away from the base and back into international waters. These included the JS Kurashima, which is a Sugashima-class minesweeper, which was deployed because it's capable of keeping pace with the Type 815G. To tackle China's more powerful ships, Japan sent out the JS Yamagiri, which is an Asagiri-class destroyer. Sea Forces says that the ship is somewhat equivalent to the Type 054A, at least in terms of size, as it measures about 450 feet long and is capable of moving at a top speed of 30 knots. Like the 054A, it has a flight deck and hangar that can house a helicopter, in this case the SH-60JK Seahawk, and it's loaded with an array of dangerous weapon systems. These include a pair of Mark 141 missile launchers, which fire RGM-84 harpoons, and a Mark 29 missile launcher equipped with 8 RIM-7 Sea Sparrow surface-to-air missiles. An Oto Melara 76mm gun offers a good counter to the Type 054A's own 76mm gun, with the Mark 16 launcher built into the ship also giving it anti-submarine capabilities. Finally, later models of the ship come equipped with a pair of Mark 15 Phalanx CIWS, a rapid-fire weapon that can rattle off up to 4,500 rounds per minute. A fair match for China's warships. And that ship was backed by a P-3C maritime patrol aircraft. Though technically considered an anti-submarine warfare craft, the P-3C is still equipped with AGM-65F Maverick and AGM-84K Slammer missiles, both more than capable of causing damage to surfaced ships. Add its AGM-84 harpoon weapons, along with a collection of torpedoes, mines, rockets, and depth charges, and the plane gave Japan an aerial advantage should China's trio of ships choose to attack. Thankfully, no attack came. China's ships left Japan's water under the surveillance of Japan's 2 ships and aircraft, with a tense situation ultimately resolving itself somewhat peacefully. Except there's a problem. This incursion into Japanese waters was far from a one-off for the Chinese Navy. It was no mistake, and Japan's bold response was warranted because China has been pulling stunts like this for years, and these patrols into Japanese territory have only been intensifying in 2024. That's according to both Newsweek and the US Naval Institute, or USNI's, news website. In early April 2024, a month before the May interception, the USNI noted several instances of ships from China's People's Liberation Army Navy, or PLAN, sailing through the waters between Japan and Taiwan. And it wasn't just ships. China has also been sending unmanned aerial vehicles and surveillance aircraft over the waters, as well as potentially allying with Russia to conduct surveillance. USNI even has a timeline. Between March 25th and March 27th, 2024, the PLAN destroyer CNS Chang'un accompanied a frigate named CMS Changzhou as they sailed within 93 miles of Miyako Island. That distance matters. According to international maritime law, a counter is allowed to claim an exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, extending up to 200 nautical miles beyond its coastline. Once that EEZ is established, the country has full jurisdiction over everything, living and non-living, within it, meaning it has full control over which ships can and can't sail through it. China coming within 93 miles of a Japanese island meant it was moving through Japanese territory without Japan's permission, and the PLAN kept on pushing its luck. Between March 27th and 28th, the ships proceeded to sail north, passing between Yonaguni Island and Taiwan, before moving to within 50 miles of Utsuri Island. Though officially owned by Japan, both China and Taiwan claim ownership of the island, with the PLAN's move likely being to intimidate Japan by showing that China is keeping an eye on the territory it believes it should own. Again, Japan shadowed the ships, sending out a DE-234 destroyer and several maritime patrol aircraft to keep an eye on China. While all of this was happening, March 25th also saw the Chinese Shupang-class survey ship Mao Yisheng move within 25 miles of Yonaguni Island, again meaning it had entered Japanese waters. Japan also tracked a Y-9 electronic surveillance aircraft, a WZ-7 unmanned aerial vehicle, or UAV, and journeys by the CNS Huainan destroyer, CNS Darking frigate, and a fleet oil tanker called CNS Kakajiliu, all of which sailed or flew into or over Japanese waters over the course of the week leading up to April 2, 2024. Add to that the Karelia, a Russian intelligence ship, which was spotted sailing 31 miles southwest of Oshakojima, and you have the constant breaking of maritime protocol by two countries that appear to be attempting to intimidate Japan. In other words, the Chinese ships that sailed near the southwestern islands were just the latest in a long line of PLAN ships that have been breaking maritime law by sailing too close to Japan. There's a clear pattern here, and it's one that's been on the rise since 2021. According to Newsweek, that year saw Japan's maritime self-defense forces intercept Chinese or Russian military vessels in its territorial waters 67 times. The following year, that number more than doubled, rising to 132. China and Russia kept their incursions stable in 2023, though they rose by one to lead to 133 interceptions. And it's clear from USNI's breakdown of a single week between March and April 2024 that the PLAN has no plans to slow down. CNN builds upon this. In May 2024, it reported that Chinese Coast Guard ships have spent a record-breaking 158 consecutive days sailing in the waters that surround several Japanese islands in the East China Sea. These islands, which Japan calls senkakus, are uninhabited but carry the potential to become catalysts for rising tensions between the two countries. Interestingly, China isn't breaking any maritime laws in this instance. Its ships are sailing in the contiguous zone around these islands, which extend another 12 nautical miles from Japan's official territorial waters. Sailing in those zones isn't illegal, even for military ships. However, maintaining a continued presence within them, as China has been doing for over 150 days, is considered an unnecessary provocation. Of course, China will claim otherwise. As with many other scraps of Japanese territory, such as the previously mentioned Utsuri Island, China believes these uninhabited islands should be its territory. Regardless, China is sending a message to Japan with all of these naval incursions. It's watching, perhaps even testing its boundaries or attempting to incite it into a military response beyond merely shadowing China's ships until they leave Japanese waters. But so far, Japan has played a clever game of sending its ships out to greet those operated by the PLAN without actively attacking them. The message is clear. The PLAN may be trying to watch or intimidate Japan in their own waters, but they can show them that they have the naval might to fight back if needed. All of which brings us to another question. What else is Japan doing to stop the Chinese Navy? We already know it's sending out ships to directly respond to PLAN incursions into its own territory. That sees Japan engaging in something of a tit-for-tat battle with China, where it's attempting to one-up its aggressive neighbor with its ships. If China sends a destroyer into Japanese waters, Japan will send one out to greet it, often with an aerial accompaniment, to send a message to China that it has the advantage in its own territory. But beyond these responses, Japan is taking active steps to bolster its naval strength, so that it's ready to fight China if the need calls for it. Take its growing alliance with a pair of other naval powers as an example. In August 2023, the US Department of Defense published a press release in which it claimed to be strengthening its defensive ties with Japan and South Korea. This trilateral agreement had been a long time in the making. Both Japan and South Korea were bilateral allies to the US before, with the three-way agreement marking a new way in which the nations could work together. As part of the agreement, the three nations promised to enhance their defensive collaboration, which includes carrying out multi-domain military exercises with one another. Information sharing is also a key part of the agreement, which is great for Japan as it benefits from its partners' knowledge about China, North Korea, and general activities within the Indo-Pacific. This trilateral agreement has already started to bear fruit for Japan. It started to run regular training operations with its new partners. One of the most recent, conducted in April 2024, saw it take part in a two-way exercise led by the USS Theodore Roosevelt. Japan sent a warship to the drill, with South Korea sending guided missile destroyers to accompany the American ships. Crucially, the drill took place in disputed waters. All spent 2 days working together in the East China Sea. The drills were followed by meetings between the three countries and leaders of the Philippines, which is another country that is wary of increasing Chinese aggression and territorial claims within its waters. Japan's partnership with the US runs even deeper. In March 2024, Al Jazeera published a report quoting Japanese government spokesman Yoshimasa Hayashi's claims that Japan and the US are discussing ways to increase collaboration and integration between their militaries. Speaking to reporters, he said, "Japan and the United States have been discussing ways to strengthen cooperations in command and control in order to enhance interoperability and readiness." These comments came during the build-up to a summit attended by US President Joe Biden and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. According to Al Jazeera, that summit involved plans to enact the biggest upgrade to the security alliance Japan shares with the United States since the two nations signed a mutual defense treaty in 1960. Why does all of this matter? It shows that Japan is taking China's threatening actions in and around its territorial waters seriously. So seriously, in fact, that it's looking to do anything it can to bolster its own naval threat to show China that Japan isn't afraid of what it's doing. These collaborative decisions are important because the simple fact is that Japan's navy likely wouldn't defeat China in a straight-up fight. According to Global Firepower, which ranks 145 military countries annually using its Power Index scoring system, Japan has the 21st strongest navy in the world based on pure fleet strength. That amounts to 155 naval assets, including 23 submarines, 36 destroyers, and 22 mine warfare vessels. However, China has Japan beaten in every respect. Global Firepower says that it has the world's second strongest navy, due to the PLAN controlling 730 vessels. That strength is debatable. You could argue that the US has a stronger navy due to its ships displacing more than twice the water of China's vessels, but the asset count alone is enough to put China well ahead of Japan. China has 61 submarines to Japan's 23, as well as 13 more destroyers, far larger fleets of frigates and corvettes, and 14 more mine warfare vessels. China also has a pair of aircraft carriers, ideal for bringing a large portion of its 1,207 fighter aircraft into a naval war scenario. Simply put, Japan isn't as strong as China. So the cooperative agreements it's forming with other nations, particularly the US and South Korea, allow it to supplement its naval strength so it can present more of a threat to China. Beijing knows that launching an attack on Japan means it's also attacking South Korea and the US, as well as further upsetting the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. It won't make the first move. That may be why it's trying to provoke Japan by assailing so many ships in Japan's territorial waters. Japan's response is intelligent and measured. Rather than attacking, it's sending ships out to observe all while working on building partnerships in the background that will help it to stand up for itself if China ever does attack. It's a similar collective defense strategy as that employed by NATO, showcasing how Japan can strengthen through collaboration. Still, that doesn't mean Japan is willing to let its navy grind to a standstill because it believes it will be defended by stronger countries if China attacks. It's also boosting its naval strength so it can put up a far better fight if it's left to face China alone. For instance, the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force has started commissioning more new ships. In April 2022, USNI News reported that Japan's navy had commissioned the JS Kumano, which is the first in what will become a fleet of the country's new Mogami-class multi-role frigates. These frigates are 436 feet long and capable of traveling at speeds in excess of 30 knots. In many ways, it's similar to the Asagiri-class destroyer Japan sent out to meet China's trio of ships in May. The Mogami class also has a flight deck and hangar capable of landing a Mitsubishi SH-60K helicopter. Plus, its weapons loadout is impressive. The highlights is the ship's 16-cell Mark 41 vertical launching system, which fires Type 03 surface-to-air missiles. An Mk145 127mm gun means it has a stronger gun than either of the two Chinese warships that encroached on Japanese territory in May. Plus, it's equipped with a pair of missile launchers that fire Type 17 SSM-2 anti-ship missiles, another great defense against China's ships. Add torpedo tubes which fire Type 12 torpedoes and a Mark 15 Mod 31 CRAM CIWS, and you get an impressive frigate that's as capable of fighting aerial threats as it is seaborne ones. It can also handle submarines. USNI News says the Mogami class is also equipped with towed array sonar and variable depth sonar, which make it suitable for anti-submarine missions. It can even lay mines if needed. But perhaps even more importantly, you get a ship that's representative of Japan's desire to invest in its navy. More news of strengthening came in 2023, courtesy of China Military. Though the source is obviously China-centric, suggesting there may be a hint of bias in its reporting, it still notes that Japan's navy is looking to strengthen further by building several unmanned combat weapons, including amphibious armored vehicles and multi-purpose unmanned vessels. Japan is also supposedly developing new anti-torpedo and ship-to-air missiles, likely intending to load both into its new multi-role frigates, as well as working on new intelligence-gathering aircraft. Again, this is a marked turnaround for a nation that typically focuses its military rhetoric on defense ahead of offense. For instance, an intelligence-gathering aircraft will be far more useful flying over Chinese waters to gather information than it would be patrolling Japan's coast. It's also a turnaround that's backed by Japan breaking its record in terms of its military budget. In August 2023, Reuters reported that Japan's defense ministry had requested 7.7 trillion yen, approximately $52.7 billion, for its 2024 defense budget. The plan is part of a wider effort to boost defense spending up to 2% of Japan's GDP between now and 2027, with Reuters noting that it's also clearly a direct response to Chinese and North Korean aggression. The 2024 budget proposal alone would represent a 13% increase on the 2023 budget, with almost 1 trillion yen being added. The Japanese Navy was heavily considered in this budget request. About 900 billion yen would go towards weapons and ammunition purchases, with a focus on air defense missiles that can be deployed from ships. Another 600 billion yen will be dedicated to bolstering Japan's defenses along its Southwest Island chains, which are the very chains that China's trio of ships sailed among in May 2024. The budget request was granted. In fact, as USNI News reports, Japan's defense ministry exceeded its target for 2024 as it was granted 7.95 trillion yen, approximately $55.9 billion, toward the end of December 2023. Japan's navy is already putting that money to good use. Naval News reports that $2.59 billion of that budget will go toward the construction of a pair of Aegis System-equipped vessels, or ASEVs, which the country aims to make the cornerstone of its missile defense system. Each of these ships will be 623 feet long and capable of displacing 12,000 tons of water. That makes the ASEV 1.7 times larger than the new Flight 3 Arleigh Burke-class missile destroyer commissioned by the US Navy. The ships will require 240 crew members to operate and will be loaded with a Mark 45 127mm gun, SM-6 missiles, and a weapon system capable of firing American Tomahawk cruise missiles. An anti-drone laser system will also be retrofitted into the new ships starting in 2032. So where does all of this leave Japan in terms of its conflict with the Chinese Navy? Simply put, the country's navy is taking a series of bold moves to react to increasing Chinese aggression. Every Chinese incursion into its territorial waters is being met with Japanese vessels that are capable of fighting the Chinese ships if they're pushed beyond their observational roles. As Japan asserts its control over its territory, it's also working alongside the United States and South Korea to enhance its naval defenses. All three countries are running semi-regular drills, occasionally in disputed waters, that show Japan is as capable of threatening China as China is of trying to intimidate Japan. Finally, there are clear signs that Japan is strengthening its navy. Its military budget, though still only around a fifth of China's $236.1 billion 2024 budget, has reached record-breaking levels. Plus, Japan is commissioning new and dangerous ships, all of which are intended to bolster its defenses while making its navy a more respectable attacking force. China certainly won't be running scared in the wake of these moves. It will continue to antagonize and provoke with its incursions into Japanese waters. However, it will also take note of the fact that Japan is responding bravely by strengthening and showing that it won't be cowed by Chinese aggression. Tensions will rise. Japan aims to be ready if those tensions boil over. Will all of this be enough for Japan's navy to overcome China's if war breaks out?
China has taken a bold step to protect its interests and gain more influence. It has built massive artificial islands, equipped with military installations and defense capabilities. But as the world looked on, China didn't see the big problem coming that would mess up its plan for more power. Here's what happened. China aims to be the world's leading superpower by the year 2049. The centennial of the Chinese Communist Party's victory over the nationalists in the Civil War and rise to power on the mainland. Unfortunately for Beijing, China's own geography works against it in achieving this goal.
China is surrounded by hostile islands that prevent it from projecting power into the world's oceans and threaten to cut off the shipping its economy relies on. To help mitigate this geographical disadvantage, China has attempted to increase its power in the strategically vital South China Sea, seizing control of disputed islands, rocks, and reefs. China has since fortified these areas by creating artificial islands and militarizing them with airfields and hangars, radar stations, anti-aircraft weapons, and ship-killing hardware. The United States and China's neighbors in the region watched this island-building campaign with great alarm, marveling at how quickly China built and militarized its islands. However, these artificial islands aren't all they're cracked up to be. In trying to solve one problem, China only created another. Let's just say that these islands might not have the staying power that China needs them to have if it wants to use them as an effective method of power projection in the first island chain. Let's explore the reasons why China built the islands to begin with, why these islands are now in trouble, and why Beijing's ambitions in the South China Sea might sink, literally. The legal origin of the artificial islands comes from China's infamous 9-line map, which it has used to claim 90% of the waters in the South China Sea. Officially, China justifies this claim and the 9-line with historical anecdotes. For example, China maintains that it and its people had been in the South China Sea since the days of the mythical Jia dynasty that supposedly began in about the year 2070 BC. Naturally, few people believe these assertions. The historical claims were fig leaves to hide a more cynical, self-interested motive. The South China Sea's waters are economically and geostrategically vital. Economically, the South China Sea has about 15% of the world's total fishing potential, 11 billion barrels of oil, and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. In 2021, 22% of the world's global trade, valued at about $5.3 trillion, passed through the shipping lanes in this area, including 60% of all maritime trade, 40% of the world's petroleum products, and 1/3 of the world's total shipping. Simply put, whoever controls these waters controls the fates of the countries that rely on this trade. China is one such country. By building its artificial islands and fortifying the area, China can more easily protect its own trade, muscle in on the natural resources in the South China Sea, and exclude the access of other nations, or at least charge them expensive tolls for the use of such resources. Geostrategically, however, the South China Sea is still trapped within the first island chain. To make matters worse for Beijing, these island nations are aligned with China's strategic rival, the United States. Because of the geopolitical alignment, the United States Navy can easily blockade a series of choke points around the South China Sea and disrupt or cut off shipping to the Chinese mainland. The most important of these choke points is the Strait of Malacca, through which China gets a large portion of its energy. In 2016, 16 million barrels of oil and 3.2 million barrels of liquefied natural gas pass through these narrow waters every day, a figure that is likely now higher. China's dependency on the trade that passes through this choke point has been called its Malacca dilemma, and Beijing has often used this supposed vulnerability as an excuse for its territorial expansion in the area. By building and militarizing islands, China can theoretically bring more ships, aircraft, and missiles closer to the Strait of Malacca and other hotspots, giving it more leverage over the choke points and making it more costly for the United States Navy to project power into the first island chain. To make a long story short, China wants to seize control of the rocks and reefs in the South China Sea to promote its own self-interest at the expense of other nations like the Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam, on whose exclusive economic zones Beijing has encroached. A 2016 ruling against Beijing by the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, which completely invalidated the 9-line as a legitimate territorial claim, was simply ignored. As is often the case in international relations, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. China had expanded its reach into the South China Sea through military means since the 1970s, when it seized control of the Paracel Islands from Vietnam. However, China began its modern campaign in the South China Sea when it seized control of the Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines in 2012. The following year, China started to expand much further. It began building artificial islands in the Spratlys, creating 3,200 new acres of land, militarizing the islands as the years went by. In total, China has 28 outposts in the waters of its supposed 9-line map, 20 of these outposts are in the Paracel Islands, an additional 7 are in the Spratlys, and it also has the Scarborough Shoal. The artificial island building campaign centered mostly on the Spratlys. Artificial islands are created by dredging and shifting material from the reefs and seafloor beneath them. Rocks and sand must be pulverized in this process, and naturally, the creation of artificial islands was destructive to the wildlife in the area. Mounds of material needed to be pulverized and moved in the process. The American Admiral Harry Harris, who was commander of the United States Pacific Fleet at the time these constructions were taking place, called these artificial islands China's Great Wall of Sand, in a speech delivered to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in March 2015. According to an analysis by the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, China has reclaimed a total of 13.5 square kilometers of land across the 7 reefs it has used in its island-building campaign. China's island-building vessels can dredge up material at impressive rates. Just one of them, the Tianjing Hao, operated by CCCC Tianjing Dredging, can deploy a cutter with the power of 4,200 kilowatts to the seabed. Material is then moved through a pipeline ashore for land reclamation purposes or onto a barge. The Tianjing Hao can deploy its cutter to a depth of 30 meters and extract 4,500 cubic meters of material per hour. Between February and March 2014, this ship was spotted conducting dredging operations in Johnson Reef in the Spratly Islands. This area has now been occupied by China, and the reef has since been militarized. Although Johnson Reef is too small to host aircraft, it is armed with anti-aircraft guns and radar systems, contributing to a potential Chinese defense in depth of the area should hostilities break out in the region. CSIS considers Johnson Reef to have been a test run for more sophisticated military structures at more famous and well-armed places like Fiery Cross Reef, Mischief Reef, and Subi Reef. The Tianjing Hao was far from the only such ship in China's dredging operations, which can only be described as having been a success. To counter China's Great Wall of Sand island-building campaign, the United States Navy has conducted Freedom of Navigation operations, FONOPs, since 2015. These operations see the close transit of US Navy ships and aircraft around the artificial islands in an attempt to ensure that the South China Sea's shipping lanes stay open. These FONOPs have done little to alter the situation in the South China Sea, however, and numerous close calls between the American and Chinese militaries in the area have led some in Washington to call for them to end. On the flip side, other national security strategists believe that ending the FONOPs and essentially ceding the military prerogative in the area to China would only allow Beijing to entrench itself in the region that much further. Without the United States Navy maintaining a presence in the area, they fear that China's People's Liberation Army Navy would be completely unfettered in asserting its will over the shipping lanes and other countries in the area. Fortunately for the United States and China's weaker regional neighbors, the US Navy might no longer need to do the heavy work alone. Nature itself is assisting in the effort to prevent Chinese hegemony in the South China Sea, because the artificial islands are starting to erode and sink. As early as 2019, it became apparent that China's islands were not as stable as Beijing was hoping for. In the first place, China has extended its reputation for often shoddy construction methods to the new islands. The Economist reported that the concrete China used in building the island bases could not cope with the elemental settings in the area. This concrete was instead turning to sponge in such conditions. Additionally, there is vast corruption within China's construction industry. This corruption has extended to China's military ambitions before. For example, in 2019, Su Bo, the overseer of construction for China's Liaoning aircraft carrier, was convicted on corruption charges and sentenced to 12 years in prison. Corruption in the construction industry has often led to substandard work, and the same appears to be the case on many of the artificial islands in the South China Sea. As is often the case, China appears to have cut corners in its construction methods. The concrete which displayed problems was not laid properly on all of the islands. For best results, metal rods should have first been driven into the seabed and then a concrete retaining wall built around the island. This was not always the case, and the structural integrity of some of the islands has begun to erode because of this lack of precaution. For China, speed and cheapness was the priority in these island-building campaigns, which explains why they were built so rapidly. Perhaps international observers should have been a little less alarmed. Much like China's Belt and Road infrastructure projects and domestic building efforts, quality control was not at the top of the list of priorities in the islands. It also does not help that China has little experience with building structures that would be designed to survive in the type of elements seen in the South China Sea. Beijing made the matter worse and exacerbated its disadvantage by refusing to call in foreign experts for assistance during the island-building campaign. The result is that the islands and the infrastructure that make up the bases on top of them were not constructed with top-of-the-line materials. In fact, the islands at Subi Reef, Mischief Reef, and Fiery Cross Reef in the Spratlys were so unstable that fighter jets from the People's Liberation Army Air Force (PLAAF) had not landed on the airfields there by 2020. This is unlike Woody Island in the Paracels, which China has militarized with a runway capable of supporting the landing of heavy bombers, a feat it had demonstrated in 2018. The lack of use of the runways in the Spratly bases begs the question of why China would choose to build such long structures if they were not going to be used for aircraft. Experts concede that the decision not to land military aircraft there may be seen as a gesture of goodwill to reduce tensions in the region. However, given China's brazen and belligerent stance, this is unlikely. By far the likelier explanation is that the islands are in some way an illusion and cannot support such operations. The weather and climate will also be problems for China going forward. A hit from a powerful typhoon could prove far more devastating to the Chinese constructions than their shoddy concrete. As ocean water warms with a warming global climate, these super typhoons will probably occur in the South China Sea more frequently. China appears to have made no plans for this contingency, however. One super typhoon in the South China Sea hitting in the wrong place might undo all the years of effort Beijing put into its island-building campaign. A warming climate causes other difficulties for China's artificial islands. These islands were not built with any seawalls or other protective infrastructure to preserve them against rising waters. However, as the climate warms, glaciers in the Arctic and Antarctic melt and add to rising seas. Since 1992, global sea levels have risen by almost 4 inches and continue to rise at a rate of about 0.15 inches per year. NASA predicts that by 2050, sea levels along the American coastline could be 10 to 12 inches higher than they are today, and the more global temperatures warm, the faster the glaciers will melt and the more rapidly the ocean will rise. For example, the ocean rose twice as fast between 2013 and 2022 than it had between 1993 and 2002. Although it's uncertain how far sea levels will rise by the end of the century, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change estimates that in the best-case scenario, sea levels will rise between 11 and 21.5 inches from now to then. In worst-case scenarios, where competition between states and resurgent nationalism takes priority over environmental concerns, sea levels could rise as high as 40 inches. These sea level rises do not necessarily mean that all coastal communities as they currently exist will need to evacuate. Many communities have seawalls and other defenses. However, China's artificial islands are built at sea level and have no such defenses against erosion and rising waters. China meant the islands to be a string of permanent fortifications in the South China Sea, but it did not build them in a way that would be fit for this purpose. The problem of sea level rise gets worse when one considers that China destroyed vast swathes of coral reef and mangroves in the construction efforts. These structures form a natural barrier against the elements. This is because they break waves and dissipate their energy. Coral reefs allow for sediment to establish itself on the shallow and flat portions of the reef, where mangroves can establish themselves. Once there, the mangroves further break apart the energy of waves and storm surges since the roots and trunks of the trees absorb some of the water. When taken together, these coral reefs and mangroves provide a first line of defense against things like sea level rise and storm surges from typhoons. However, China destroyed these same ecosystems when it began constructing its artificial islands. In an ironic twist that some observers might call a case of poetic justice, China wiped out the very defenses that their islands would have needed to have more staying power in the wake of a warming climate, rising sea levels, and more frequent and powerful typhoons. In 2019, China claimed that it would begin work to restore the coral reefs in the Spratly Islands. China's Ministry of Natural Resources said that facilities to protect and recover these reefs had been installed on Fiery Cross, Subi, and Mischief reefs. It also said it would survey more areas to identify where coral reefs had been damaged or destroyed and adopt a combination of natural and artificial methods to help the reefs recover themselves. However, China does not exactly have a good track record in this area because in 2015, its State Oceanic Administration claimed that construction of the artificial islands did not alter the health of the Spratly Islands ecosystem. These statements came at the same time that ships like the Tianyinghao were dredging and pulverizing the coral reefs. China also claimed that overfishing and natural causes had damaged the reef long before construction began. With such history, it's little wonder why few trusted China's word in 2019. And about 5 years later, there is still little evidence that China has meaningfully worked to restore the coral reefs in the Spratly Islands. Perhaps as sea levels rise and the risk of severe typhoons increase, Beijing will have no choice but to try to make good on its word out of calculations of self-interest. It has invested significant national prestige into its artificial island building campaign and created much bitterness around the world as the price for it. If these islands were to fail in their purpose, Beijing will have wasted a large amount of resources for little gain. However, there is another danger that comes with investing so much to try to shore the artificial islands up. Such investment in some ways defeats the very reason to build fortifications in the first place. The purpose of fortification is not to be an impregnable defense, but to make it more costly for an enemy to project power, and to free resources for the builder of the fortification to project power in other theaters. By leaving comparatively few soldiers or weapon systems in a fortification, these assets of military power can be deployed elsewhere where they can be put to better use. However, at the rate the islands are deteriorating and threatened by weather and climate, China might need to continually concentrate resources on saving this Great Wall of Sand, rather than using it as an effective method of statecraft. The fortifications that were supposed to be an aid to Chinese power projection might increasingly become a drain on it, as they become more expensive to maintain in terms of money and labor hours spent on them. In some ways, the problems facing the artificial islands in the South China Sea were predictable, as they follow a historical pattern concerning China. China is and always has been a colossus of a nation. However, it also has a history of not being able to live up to its full potential. For example, it was the wealthiest country in the world even into the 19th century. But despite this, it was unable to effectively use this advantage to compete with the Western powers and Japan. Now, history might be repeating itself. China is again a wealthy and powerful nation, but it is increasingly plagued with problems that might not permit it to achieve the full potential of its recovered status on the world stage. The expansion in the South China Sea has mirrored this age-old conundrum for Beijing. At first, it appeared the island-building campaign would solidify its place on the road to hegemony in the area. But through alienation of its neighbors, poor planning, and shoddy construction, these edifices might be the latest example of history repeating itself, with China not being able to take advantage of its latent potential. The islands were supposed to be a signal to the world that China was back, rejuvenated, as Xi Jinping might say. But if they sink, it will be a signal of another sort. There is no doubt that the artificial islands succeeded in accomplishing China's short-term goals for the South China Sea. However, the game of nations is always a marathon and not a sprint. If the islands cannot stay for the long haul, they will cost China far more than they have gained for it. But what do you think about China's artificial islands in the South China Sea? Do you think they will have the staying power and can be an effective method of power projection for China in the future?
How do we really know what's powerful and what's just show? This question gets pretty interesting when you look at China's military growth under Xi Jinping since 2013. They're now rolling with the world's second biggest military budget and might even spend 4% of their GDP on defense. For a somewhat overlooked military force in the 2000s, China has jumped up to having the biggest navy around, complete with modern aircraft carriers and a bunch of high-tech gear. But here's the thing, is China's military muscle as strong as it looks, or is it overhyped? Could it be more of a paper tiger than a real powerhouse? In this video, we're going to dig into these questions and try to figure out what China's military is really made of. Russia's invasion of Ukraine naturally prompted a second look at the supposedly new and improved Chinese military. For years under Putin's rule, Western experts feared the supposedly modern military Moscow was building, only to find that it stumbled forward in Ukraine through sheer mass, taking hundreds of thousands of casualties in exchange for minimal territorial gains over 2 years. Could something similar be at work in China? Was it another example of an authoritarian country trying to look stronger than it really was? Modernizing China's military has been one of Xi Jinping's top priorities since taking power, but over the second half of 2023, he still saw the necessity of going through another purge. 9 generals from the People's Liberation Army were fired,
3 of those were serving in the PLA's prized rocket force, which oversees China's vast stockpile of conventional missiles and its nuclear arsenal. Another of the sacked officers was the naval commander, responsible for the South China Sea. Even China's defense minister, Li Shangfu, was fired and replaced. Other sacked officers were responsible for procurement of supplies. Military equipment suppliers have also been on the chopping block. Neither Xi nor sources close to him have given a reason for the purge, but as early as December 30th, analysts guessed that it involved corruption over the acquisition of military equipment. As we've seen in Ukraine, such centers of corruption will prove disastrous for a fighting force in the field. Perhaps it shouldn't be surprising that Xi became so concerned. In January 2024, some of the clouds began to lift. American intelligence sources revealed that China's rocket force had taken to fielding missiles filled with water rather than fuel, and that some of the country's silos were constructed with improper lids, which would prevent missiles stored in them from being launched. To make matters worse for the Chinese military, US intelligence suggested that corruption in the rocket force and the broader PLA was so damaging that Xi would need to recalculate whether China would be able to make any military moves in the foreseeable future. In its official New Year's Day statement released in Mandarin, the PLA said it was in a battle against corruption and reminded its personnel to stay vigilant. The reports from American intelligence did not state which missiles had been filled with water, but either way, the PLA rocket force's prestige has taken a big blow, which is dangerous for China. Much of its military buildup and approach to deterrence has involved the acquisition of thousands of ballistic and cruise missiles as part of its anti-access area denial strategy for a confrontation with the United States. If it cannot effectively carry out this strategy, it cannot contest the US military around the First Island chain. Tom Shugart, a former officer in the US Navy, now with the Center for a New American Strategy, accurately called the rocket force China's crown jewel and a center of gravity for the Chinese military. For China, this is the force that must be the most effective in carrying out its mission, and yet it might be one of the centers of corruption. Yao Cheng, a former lieutenant colonel with the PLAAF who defected to the United States in 2016, discussed the extent of corruption in the Chinese military with Radio Free Asia after the recent reports emerged. The budget for dinners and gifts is taken from the equipment department. Some military departments have no money, and if they need money, their chief has to allocate some from the equipment budget. The equipment budget would have been sufficient, but not after being misappropriated. When I was in the military, we would drain fuel from aircraft fuel tanks for cooking, which burns green and has no smell at all. When we would eat hot pot, we would take out the solid fuel in the missiles piece by piece because there were insufficient supplies. I would often go along to the armory and ask them for a small round piece of solid fuel when we wanted to have hot pot. Unfortunately for China, the problems in its military go far deeper than its vaunted rocket force. China's new navy is another item of pride for its military. Under Xi, China has steadily grown to a relative level of sea power that it has arguably not seen since the days of the Ming treasure fleets under Zheng He in the 15th century. China now has the world's largest navy by number of vessels, with 426 units in its fleet as of January 2024. Among these are 3 aircraft carriers, the Liaoning, the Shandong, and the Fujian. The Fujian is a step above the other 2, as it's the first Chinese aircraft carrier to use a catapult system, which allows its planes to be launched faster than the ski jump system used on its other carriers, which are based on Russian designs. The Liaoning is in fact the sister ship of Russia's troubled Admiral Kuznetsov aircraft carrier. The Fujian is only the second ship in the world to have an electromagnetic catapult, coming after the USS Gerald R. Ford. This is a big step forward because traditional steam catapults require more maintenance than an electromagnetic one. The Fujian's arrival was therefore a symbol to both China and the wider world about its growing naval capabilities. Although the new aircraft carriers represent a significant improvement in China's navy, they are not all they're cracked up to be. The aircraft carrier is useless unless there are planes to fly from it. This is a problem for the PLAN, as China has a serious shortage of trained naval aviators. As a sign of its commitment to naval aviation, China established the Naval Aeronautical University in Yantai in its Shandong province in 2017. The new institution meant that the PLAN would be emphasizing training naval pilots on its own, rather than continuing with the previous practice of picking them out of the PLAAF's ranks. Unfortunately for Beijing, China's lack of institutional experience has been quick to show itself, and the new institution has lacked the necessary equipment to bring it up to par with American standards. One of China's biggest problems is that it lacks a plane dedicated to training aviators in taking off and landing on a carrier. The current plane for this purpose is the JL-9G, which was first unveiled in 2011. This plane can't be used to simulate emergency landings on a carrier because it flies too slowly and because the plane itself is too light. Because of these design flaws, China's would-be naval aviators are limited to training on land-based simulated carriers. China has only one carrier-based fighter, the Shenyang J-15 Flying Shark, but only about 60 of them have been built. It's also a much heavier aircraft than the JL-9G, with an empty weight of 17.5 tons, compared to the JL-9G's 7.8. The J-15 has a top speed of Mach 2.4, compared to the JL-9G's Mach 1.05. The differences between the two planes make China's current training regimen less than ideal for fielding pilots for the PLAN. The result is that China has had a tough time fielding a roster of 200 pilots to operate 130 aircraft for its aircraft carriers. The Fujian in particular has another problem. Although it resembles American aircraft carriers in some important ways, its insides are much different. Unlike them, it's not powered by nuclear propulsion. Instead, the Fujian is powered by steam turbines and boilers. As a result, the Fujian lacks the range and operational durability of its American rivals. It will not be able to stay at sea as long as they can. This is less of a problem when China expects a confrontation to take place close to its home waters. However, Xi Jinping has made building a world-class military by the middle of the century one of his highest priorities. For greater power projection, capable of competing with the United States on a global level, the Fujian falls short, even if it could adequately staff its pilots and aircraft roster. The weaknesses in the Fujian and China's previous two aircraft carriers are partly why efforts are underway to build a fourth aircraft carrier, the Type 004. This one will be nuclear-powered. In late 2023 and early 2024, the Fujian began its sea trials, signaling that it was almost ready for frontline service. In February 2024, China was seen testing an unspecified carrier-based aircraft that a few observers have called the J-35, which would be China's second fifth-generation aircraft. We will need to wait and see how this plane could change the situation. Even so, China still lags significantly behind the United States in naval aviation experience, and that is a gap harder to fill than the number of aircraft carriers. China has also made significant improvements to its air force in the past 10 to 15 years. Prior to that, it was often operating obsolete second-generation aircraft. This is no longer the case, with the PLAAF now relying on the fourth-generation J-10 and J-16 and the fifth-generation Chengdu J-20 Mighty Dragon. The J-20 in particular is an item of pride for the Chinese brass. It's the third fifth-generation aircraft to be produced in significant numbers. American war planners respect it enough to make giving the F-35 its Block 4 upgrades a high priority. One expert said that he thought a contest between the current F-35 and J-20 would be uncomfortably close. The J-20 had its maiden flight in 2011, came into service in 2017, and recently got a new engine, the domestically produced WS-15, which is expected to enter service in 2025. It had previously used the Russian-made AL-31 engine, developed for the fourth-generation Su-34, which limited its capabilities. The new engine is expected to allow the J-20 to fly at supersonic speed without afterburners for extended durations and to provide greater thrust and maneuverability. Aviation experts expect the WS-15 to make the J-20 the world's leading aircraft in thrust output until sixth-generation fighters like America's NGAD arrive on the scene. The J-20 has other formidable capabilities. It can engage targets from beyond visual range, as it comes armed with long-range missiles like the 200km PL-15 and the purported 300km PL-21. The J-20's exact radar system is unknown, but it is believed to be an AESA radar that possibly features stolen technology from the F-35. Like the Lightning II, the J-20 mounts electro-optical and infrared sensors on its frame to provide 360-degree coverage for sensor fusion and can likely share this data with friendly assets elsewhere. If so, there is potential for the J-20 to act as an airborne early warning and command and control plane, leaving out the need for specialized, large and slow aircraft to perform this purpose. Despite the J-20s being a clear advancement in China's domestic aviation and arms industries, even some Chinese experts say their new plane is not up to America's best fighters. One analyst in Beijing's Wang security think tank mentioned that the F-35's XA-100 engine is at least a decade ahead of the WS-15. Some international aviation experts report that the J-20 lacks maneuverability, which would make it vulnerable in a dogfight with enemy fighters. Others disagree, but this is of secondary importance. The worst thing is that some aviation experts also question whether the J-20 is a true fifth-generation aircraft, a true stealth fighter. While acknowledged as being stealthier than Russia's Su-57 Felon, the F-22 and F-35 likely have significantly lower radar cross-sections than the J-20, which would give them a big advantage in a confrontation. Like the Su-57, the J-20 has its highest-performing stealth features concentrated in the front of the plane, while comparatively lacking from the sides and rear. This might be fine if the J-20 approaches its targets from the front, but if it needs to turn or maneuver, it is likely significantly more visible and imperiled. In contrast, the F-35 reportedly has the radar cross-section of a metal golf ball at about 0.001 square meters. If so, this would likely give the F-35 an advantage between 1 and 2 orders of magnitude in stealth compared to the J-20. The F-22 would also be stealthier than the J-20 on this assessment, although the USAF brass acknowledged it is less stealthy than the F-35. The J-20's radar, while an advancement, is also not all it's cracked up to be. Because the J-20 began with the JXX program of the 1990s, its radar is an early Chinese AESA radar. Although this is a big step up compared to China's previous fighter aircraft and likely gives the J-20 enhanced situational awareness and detection against targets with low cross-sections, it's still hard-pressed to match the F-35's AN/APG-81, much less the coming AN/APG-85, and likely can't replicate the F-35's flying supercomputer attributes. Although we cannot know for certain unless we see an actual confrontation, it's likely that America's fifth-generation fighters will be able to avoid detection and shoot the J-20 down before it can spot them. The J-20 is also probably at a disadvantage against the F-22 in a dogfight. China's newest bomber may have more unrealistic claims. Since China has tried to evolve its military into one capable of strategic power projection rather than a fighting force more suited to defense, it has also seen a need to upgrade its bomber force. In 2016, it revealed a new bomber, the Jian H-20, which it sought to be an answer to America's stealth bombers, the B-2 and coming B-21, and the final piece of its nuclear triad. Initial reports suggested that the H-20 would have a range of 10,000 kilometers. This is a range greater than the B-2, and one which would put all American and Allied targets in the Indo-Pacific region in danger. It could also put Hawaii in danger, and if the bomber took an Arctic flight route, such a range would be sufficient to reach the 49 other states, that is without aerial refueling. The H-20 has other reportedly impressive features. It may be able to carry a payload between 10 and 20 tons, in line with the B-2's 18. Chinese sources claim that the payload will far exceed the B-2 with a 45-ton limit. The new bomber will also supposedly carry 4 stealth or hypersonic missiles. The H-20 seems to be a plane designed for deep penetration missions, relying on stealth features rather than speed or maneuverability to get within an enemy's air defense zone. The bomber's exterior appears to have a stealth design with a blended wing body, embedded engine, and lack of vertical structures. The fact that this purported design looks like a knockoff of the B-2 reveals China's intentions for it. It should also come with a new AESA radar to better identify threats and high-priority targets, and for improved electronic warfare attributes. The H-20, if it were to come online, would be a big improvement over China's current go-to bomber, the X-6, which is based on the Soviet Tu-16 Badger that originated in the early 1950s. But there are problems for Beijing. One of them is that this bomber has yet to fly and seems to be behind schedule. In July 2022, Chinese media sources reported that the H-20 was close to ready for its maiden flight. This has still not occurred as of February 2024. Plans are in place for the bomber to be operational before the end of the decade, but China has yet to even publicly unveil it. The most anyone has seen of it is on 2 videos. The first was a 2018 video released by the H-20's manufacturer, the Aviation Industry Corporation of China, AVIC. The footage revealed an airplane underneath a large drape. The second came in a PLAAF recruiting ad in 2021, which revealed a previously unknown flying wing-type aircraft reflected on the visor of a pilot. Perhaps there are reasons for its lack of a maiden flight. A plane with the H-20's purported wing design would need to be much larger than thought in order to carry a 45-ton payload. Meanwhile, to carry its large payload over its supposed long range, the H-20 would need to carry much more fuel than a typical bomber. When reporting on the H-20 in its assessment of Chinese air power in 2020, the Pentagon believed it would have more modest features, such as an 8,500-kilometer range and a 10-ton payload. The Pentagon concedes that the H-20 is a significant leap from China's current bomber capability, but believes that the claims some have made of it are too unrealistic. In terms of stealth, the H-20 will be much less detectable than China's traditional bombers. However, its design may not be as good as the B-2 or B-21. The bomber may be able to adjust its wings from angled to straight in order to improve its stealth. If not, the angled protrusion will make it less stealthy. Even the presence of an adjustable seam for the wings would make the plane more detectable than if it had a smooth design. The wing configuration, while a leap forward, still suggests that China is learning when it comes to engineering stealth aircraft. There is no doubt that China's military has come a long way in the past 25 years, particularly in the past 10 under Xi Jinping. It's closed the gap in capability with the United States, but its problems only reveal how far behind it was to begin with. China still lacks experience in creating a combined arms military with cutting-edge technology. It would be dangerous to assume that most of China's missiles are filled with water, as we saw what its rocket force, air force, and navy are capable of in exercises off Taiwan in 2022 and 23. However, as recent events have made clear, China's military also suffers from internal problems. Corruption will likely continue within the PLA's ranks. Though the pay structure has improved, officers are still not paid well, and military expenditures lack transparency. Realities like this make double timing a natural response. China's long-term demographic problems will also pose a problem for its military. With an aging population, it will have increasing difficulties in recruiting new personnel. The PLA has presented a bold and aggressive new face to the world, but behind the facade, it still has many shortcomings if it plans on challenging the US military for global dominance, as Xi Jinping wants it to do. What do you think about China's supposed latest and greatest gear and the corruption scandal that broke out between late 2023 and early 24? What else might China be hyping, and what other problems might Xi Jinping's China dream have in manifesting into reality?